This is a regular meeting of the Redondo Beach Planning Commission, Thursday, July 20th of 2023. It's 6:32 in the evening, and I think we will start with the pledge, and then we'll call the meeting to order. Okay, and we'll call do I have a motion to call this meeting to order?
Yes.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say no. All right, so it's unanimous. Okay, pledge, I'm going to call upon Commissioner Lamb to lead us in a salute to the flag. And not a song.
Everybody ready? I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Commissioner Lamb. And let's have a roll call now that we have a contingent. Ask for a roll call.
Commissioner Light,
Present.
Commissioner Boswell,
Present.
Commissioner Godek, Commissioner Hazeltine,
Here.
Commissioner Hensley,
Here.
Commissioner Lamb,
Here.
Chair Gaddis.
I am here. Okay, approval of the order of agenda. Does anybody have any changes to the agenda? Order of agenda? All right, do I have a motion to approve the order of agenda?
Motion to approve the order of the agenda.
And a second?
And second.
All right, all those in favor say aye. Aye. And all those against say no. It is unanimous approval. Blue folder items. These are additional backup materials to administrative reports and/or public comments received after the printing and distribution of the agenda packet for receive and file. I haven't seen any blue folder. Were there some?
There was a blue folder item that came in. It was additional information on the item J1.
Oh,
Mandatory findings.
oh,
They were all no impact.
Typo.
okay. Well, I didn't check email before leaving, so. Do I have a motion to receive and file blue folder items?
Motion to receive and file blue folder item.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those against say no. It passes unanimously. The consent calendar, these are our business items except those formally noticed for public hearing or those pulled for discussion. They're assigned to the consent calendar. Commission members may request that any consent calendar items be removed, discussed, and acted upon separately. Items removed from the consent calendar will be taken up under the excluded consent calendar section, and those remaining on the consent calendar will be approved in one motion. And I will call upon anyone wishing to address the commission on any consent calendar item on the agenda which has not been pulled by the commission for discussion. Each speaker will be permitted to speak only once, and comments will be limited to a total of 3 minutes. Do we have anyone who wants to speak on any consent calendar item? No. Do we have any?
Yeah.
Of course.
It's been a while. I will item F2.
Okay, number 2, F2?
Yep.
Okay. Do I have a motion to approve F1 and F3?
Motion to approve F1 and F3.
Second? Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those against say no. Approved unanimously. Okay, what's up with F2?
Sure. So F2 is the minutes. I just had a question, Director Forbes. I sent an edit a couple days ago, but I didn't hear back any confirmation.
Yeah, we'll need to review
More time?
the request and verify that.
Okay, no problem. So then I'll make a motion to continue the March minutes to next month's Planning Commission meeting and approve the May minutes at this meeting.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those against say no. Approved unanimously. Our next section is the public participation on non-agenda items. This section is intended to provide members of the public with the opportunity to comment on any subject that does not appear on this agenda for action. This section is limited to 30 minutes. Each speaker will be afforded 3 minutes to address the commission. Each speaker will be permitted to speak only once. Written requests, if any, will be considered first under this section. Do we have any written requests for the public participation on non-agenda items. It's trial by fire.
So there's none? No. There are no comments at this time.
All right. Do we have anyone present who would like to speak on non-agenda items? All right. Our next section is ex parte communication. This section is intended to allow all the officials the opportunity to reveal any disclosure or ex parte communication about our public hearing tonight. We'll start with Commissioner Lamb.
Yes, for ACAP, I spoke with Mr. Kapovich from the Waterfront and Economic Development Department.
Okay,
And that's it.
that's it. Commissioner Hensley.
Yeah, I spoke to the staff on item J1.
Commissioner Hazeltine.
Commissioner Lamb and I had a very brief conversation. Did you forget it?
I did.
I
You
guess.
did not disclose this conversation, Commissioner.
I know. Oh, it was brief. It was brief on parking ideas. And
Oh, that's right.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. We did.
and L1. Are we doing just the first one?
It's
There's
only for
only one.
J1.
Yeah.
There's it's only for the public
Okay.
hearing.
Okay, that's it.
All right. Commissioner.
I do not have any.
All right. Commissioner Boswell.
It gets complicated. So is it considered, should I be mentioning someone that I tried to talk to but dodged both questions?
You could say members of the public, staff,
But
mention
if
the
there
other
was no
commissioners.
conversation
If there
at
was no,
all,
if you didn't speak with somebody, if you didn't,
if I spoke with somebody and asked about these issues, but they
didn't
dodged
Didn't say
the
anything.
whole thing.
Does that count?
How about those
Can you
Dodgers?
tell us what happened exactly?
Would it count?
I think I know what he's talking about.
that is a good question. I would err on the side of caution and suggest that you did just because you actually had a conversation.
Then that would be Rob Gaddis and Councilmember Behrens.
I did not dodge
You
it.
can guess which one.
I swear.
Our fearless leader,
Well,
Right.
there's about a
right.
50-50 chance of guessing who it was.
Commissioner Light.
Oh, and members of the public.
Okay.
Brief conversation with Commissioner Lamb a couple
She
weeks ago
disclosed it.
about general issues related to what's going to happen when I actually get here. And yesterday, a brief conversation with Rob Gaddis as well, similar.
All right. And I spoke with Commissioner Light, Commissioner Boswell, members of the public, and that's it for me.
And just to confirm, for your conversation with Commissioner Lamb, it wasn't on this particular agenda item, it was in general.
It was a general thing of what types of things we were going to be talking about.
Got
So
it.
it
So-
might have come up.
Yeah, so that,
this is- yeah.
technically, that won't necessarily fall under the ex parte. It'll be what you disclose on that particular item.
Gotcha.
Yep. great.
Yeah,
And welcome
And I knew
aboard.
nothing about that item at that point.
And to be clear, just so everybody knows that, you know, with 7 people on the commission, one commissioner can talk with 2 other commissioners, but those 2 other commissioners can talk with each other, but none of those 3 can talk yet with a 4th person. So
on the commission.
on the commission, right?
Correct.
So it does get a little tricky, but we have to remember
I think we're
to
really good at it.
conform to the Brown Act, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a public hearing. Let's have a motion to open public hearing J1.
Motion to open public hearing, J1.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those against say no. Okay, unanimously. Okay, this is a public hearing for the consideration of an initial study, negative declaration in zoning ordinance amendments that serve to implement and make consistent with the Artesia and Aviation Corridors Area Plan, which we will refer to as the ACAP through the evening with the City of Redondo Beach zoning ordinance considering parking regulations. The purpose of the zoning ordinance amendments are to create more flexibility and options regarding parking within the ACAP that serve to right-size parking throughout the ACAP and incentivize the preferred uses, that is offices and restaurants, and recommended design elements such as outdoor dining. And I'll turn it over to staff for their.
Yeah, so I just wanted to introduce Greg Kapovich is our Waterfront Economic Development Director, and Sean Scully is our Planning Manager. So I'm going to turn it over to them, let them take on this particular item.
Thank you, Brandy. Again, Greg Kapovich, thanks for having me back 2 months in a row. Pretty rare stuff here. We're coming back to you with the second ordinance to implement some of the measures in the ACAP. This time, we're going to be talking about parking. But before we start, can you start the presentation for me? Before we start getting into the details, I'm going to go over the agenda for this item in particular. I'm going to give some context, give a little bit of background before Sean really gets into the nitty-gritty of the parking study that was accomplished, the CEQA environmental review. He'll go line item by line item on the proposed changes. At that point, staff will be done with our presentation and we'll be able to take any questions that you may have. We have some of our consultants here. We have Danielle and Marco from Rincon, and we have Marta from Fair and Piers. So we'll answer any questions that you may have. Then we encourage you to take public testimony, consider, discuss, ask more questions amongst yourself, close the public hearing, and then hopefully, we hope that you end up providing a positive recommendation to City Council, but truly that is up to you. You have three choices. That is a positive, full on, we support everything Greg's talking about tonight. The second is we could support it with some changes. And the third is we hate everything and we recommend denial. I'm hopeful we don't do that third one. So again, just a quick reminder for the audience that's watching and for those of you that weren't here last time, the ACAP is the Artesia and Aviation Corridors Area Plan. It was approved by City Council. It has specific implementation measures to essentially reduce vacancy, encourage redevelopment, revitalize the area, and reorient the corridor from vehicle dependency to more pedestrian oriented and neighborhood serving. So we want the business community to support the commercial corridor on weekdays from 9 to 5, but we want those 22,000 or so residents that are nearby to support it at night and on the weekends. So really looking for that balance between the neighborhood and the working community for a 7-day-a-week opportunity for businesses to thrive. So at our last meeting, all the items here with a check mark were discussed and ultimately approved by council this past month. Now we're going to be talking about the parking one, which is highlighted here. So these are the actual specific changes, and I'll get into them in a second, but you saw the entitlement process last month where we allowed offices and restaurants to become a little bit more easier to locate along the corridor. We essentially allowed offices by right on the ground floor. We allowed restaurants that are over 2,000 square feet to not necessarily go through a conditional use permit process, but to go through an administrative process. And that was to add certainty to the process, reduce the time frame necessary for them to circumvent the process, and to reduce cost. There's a second kind of issue when you talk about prospective businesses wanting to locate here, and that has to do with on-site parking. Our parcel inventory along the corridor is essentially a bunch of parcels that are narrow and shallow, and that makes it really difficult to situate the required on-site parking on the same site as the building. And in a lot of situations, the built environment's already there. What's there is there. So if a restaurant wants to locate there and they have a higher parking requirement than what was there before, without any options on the table to present them to get creative, it's just a simple no at the front counter. So we're really trying to alleviate that tonight. So what we're doing tonight is we're creating a use permit process that says, okay, restaurant that wants to locate here, we're not going to slam the door shut on you because you can't meet on-site parking requirements, but we are willing to listen. And if you want to apply for a use permit and go through the process, you can seek either a parking reduction, You can implement valet parking, mechanical lifts, shared parking, offsite and onsite. But you're going to need to show us through parking studies and evidence that this is going to work. And we'll look at things on a case-by-case basis. So in that ends to the means is the discussion isn't just a absolute. It's a prove to us otherwise and we'll consider it. The other thing we're doing is we're actually reducing the parking requirement for our preferred uses, for those restaurants and for those offices, and that's just to further encourage it. I will add, before we get into the details with Sean here, that there's one additional city council direction that we received in relation to parking, and that is an ongoing parking evaluation, whether that be yearly or quarterly. We haven't figured that out yet. We'll probably ask council when we get to that point. But essentially what they want us to do is contract with a firm like Fair and Peers, not necessarily Fair and Peers, but someone like them, to essentially every once in a while review what these changes have done to protect the neighborhoods around it. What we don't want to do is create unintended consequences where we end up having spillover parking into the neighborhoods, as an example. So we'll be monitoring this, and if the studies, the yearly check-ins, if you will, result in any unintended consequences, we can come back to this commission and try to correct those if necessary. It's not a part of your decision package tonight because it doesn't require an ordinance change. It doesn't require any entitlement to implement it. It's really a budgetary action. So if this gets approved, recommended for approval tonight, and eventually approved by council, staff will go back to council at a budgetary time and request money for that contract. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean.
Thank you, Greg. Chair, members of the Planning Commission, Sean Scully, Planning Manager. So if you wouldn't mind, Greg, going to the next slide. So I'm going to just hit this quickly. We've kind of mowed this ground before. It's the background, the story of how we got here. It's been a long road. The ACAP was originally initiated. We've got a couple of planning commissioners that were there at the ground floor as part of the General Plan Advisory Committee's work. That's when it all started back in 2017. And as part of that initial work, there was a number of technical studies that were conducted to inform the ACAP, economic and market feasibility, traffic infrastructure, and particularly of interest, the parking utilization study that was initially done. Then we went through a 3 years of workshops, public meetings, community meetings, and surveys that really pulled it all together. And then we had the public hearing process with this body and then on to the city council for final adoption back on December 8th, 2020. Next slide. So this slide's a little bit, so what's happened since the adoption? The council approved a budget in 2021 to make the ACAP, essentially activate the ACAP and make it consistent with the general plan and the zoning ordinance. So that's what we did at our June 1st special meeting. There was also, and then the other piece is what we're doing tonight, which is the follow-up kind of trailer item, which is look at the parking options as another incentive. So we did 2 environmental studies. I'm not going to get too much into the environmental, but we did most of the heavy lifting with CEQA and the analysis with our activation of ACAP. With that document, we really had to look at, the first thing we had to answer, the first question we had to answer was, okay, what does a revitalized ACAP area look like? What is the build out of that? What's going to happen? How much, we know we want restaurant and office. How much are we going to see after we initiate all these recommendations and strategies in the ACAP? So we really went to work on that, and all those incentives and revitalization strategies were looked at, and then we actually looked at Riviera Village as our target, our guide to what does the successful corridor look like in terms of a land use mix. And once we put that together, we assumed all of these incentives that we've built in, like what Greg referenced, the AUP process for restaurants, the increase in FAR, and then tonight, all these flexible parking options. We assumed those in our build out, and we came up with about 36,000 square feet of new office and restaurant. And then we were able, with this new land use mix, we were able to analyze that. And we had to do that as part of the last initial study that was done for the ACAP activation. This environmental document that you're looking at tonight that accompanies this ordinance amendment is much more finite. And just another kind of side note on the CEQA process, up until like 2020, 2021, you could look at trip generation, you could look at levels of service, you could look at parking as an issue of concern with respect to traffic or transportation items. Those are no longer part of the CEQA analysis. So it really hemmed in even more what we were looking at with respect to the parking amendments that you're looking at tonight. So as a result, it led to what we determined to be no impact with respect to these amendments. So I wanted to kind of clarify that for you before we got too far. Next slide. So so the other thing I wanted to do was connect the dots between ACAP and what we're doing tonight. And I was just curious when I started looking at this, and I ran a little search for parking, and it comes up nearly 500 times in the ACAP. I mean, this is one of the primary tools that we're looking at to help revitalize and incentivize the preferred uses that we want to see. So just a couple things ahead of all the items that are listed in the ACAP, and I won't go through all of them, but we did the parking utilization study that I mentioned, and we really determined there was definitely capacity for parking, additional parking in the corridor. It's very underutilized. And then we did a market analysis and development feasibility study. And that one of the key takeaways was allow for flexible parking standards for desired uses. So, and then these next few items, it's very redundant, very explicit. Throughout the document, there's recommendations to relax parking requirements, to incentivize development of preferred uses, establish more efficient parking solutions, reduce parking for requirements for preferred uses over and over. If you want to go to the next slide, Greg. It's throughout the document, including, if you go back, to the implementation table. There's a number of implementation items that reference what we're doing tonight. So you can go on to the next slide. So one of the final actions that council initiated us to do after ACAP had been adopted was the parking implementation plan. So, that's really the foundation for what we're doing tonight too. Farron Pierce is here as well. Marta, if we have any additional questions on it, but it was a comprehensive analysis. It consolidated all the community input and the city council's direction since the adoption of ACAP. And then one of the initial things we did was try to come up with the future parking needs. What do when ACAP is realized as we intend, what are the future parking needs? And so the study really details those out, and it applied all the implementation, revitalization strategies that we're talking about with respect to parking, as well as all the other ones that we've already adopted. And it modeled, kind of the future parking needs. And it also incorporated these three scenarios in terms of how the city may adopt these future mobility options like Uber and autonomous vehicles. And it ran it as if, under a low, medium, and high scenario. And, the high being there was a lot of adoption of these strategies. But even with the low adoption of the city, as long as we maintained all our street parking. The study determined no additional parking would be needed based on the underutilization on our private lots. Next slide. And then there was as before the parking implementation plan got completed, there was also some community workshops and a survey. This slide, kind of outlines what resulted from those. There were 4 options that were introduced to the public. Public garages if on-street parking is converted. Support for parking meters were discussed. Dynamic monitoring of parking facilities. And then the last one, option 4, it's kind of the low-hanging fruit. And it actually was essentially tied with parking garages if parking is removed from the street as the most supported option. And that's, reduce parking flexibility, reduce parking requirements, and shared parking. So we took that to the council, and they concurred, and they directed staff to move forward with option 4, parking flexibility, adjusting requirements, and providing innovative options. And then as Greg had alluded to, the council, there was a lot of discussion with the council about those unintended consequences, that spillover parking. If we reduce all the parking requirements, could there be some impacts on those adjacent neighborhoods? And they were very concerned about that. And so they're very supportive of future parking surveys to keep an eye on this and adjust it if necessary. If we do see a lot more parking spilling over into those adjacent residential neighborhoods. So next slide. So this slide, and we can kind of land here when this body wants to start getting into these issues, and it'll help guide that discussion. This is kind of a line by line. It's like Greg's earlier slide, but just a little more detail as to what we're doing tonight. And I'll quickly run through them. We're amending the zoning ordinance. One of the general provisions at the outset of our parking regulations just basically says there are additional parking flexibility standards applicable only to the ACAP area. So what we're doing tonight is only for the ACAP area. All the other city parking regulations still apply to all the other, commercial and residential properties throughout the city. And then the number 1 item is the reduction for the preferred uses for office and restaurant uses to 1 space per 300 square feet. And I also have up there, what the existing regulations are for office, medical, and business, as well as restaurant. And then the next item, amend parking required for outdoor seating. We're going to change, those current requirements are for the first 12 seats or 25% of your indoor seats. You don't have to provide any additional parking for outdoor dining. We're changing that to 16 outdoor seats or 30% of the number of indoor seats. So relaxing that standard. And then there are adding provisions to allow businesses to pursue these flexible parking solutions. And they're all laid out beneath that line item. So there's multiple options: valet parking, tandem parking. Again, they have to come in with an administrative use permit, and we review those, the merits of their parking survey and their parking analysis that they do would determine if we're able to approve it or not. We can condition it accordingly. So that's kind of the palette of all the flexible options that are proposed tonight. And we have the actual resolution with the specific language in the ordinance. We could pull that up if we need to. And then the last couple of items, add provisions requiring that the Planning Commission reviews these types of matters, these flexible options, whenever whenever the project itself requires a conditional use permit or planning commission design review, then whatever flexible parking options the applicant might pursue would fall to this body to determine if it's appropriate or not. And then we also have an additional provision for performance standards that allow the community development director to add condition to address impacts that may come up. If that project actually went to this body, it'd be coming back to you to deal with that. So this slide really encompasses the proposed zoning ordinance amendments tonight. So we'll just jump ahead real quick and then we can come back to that slide. So this CEQA determination here, and the red first bullet is really, I'm emphasizing the ACAP activation initial study and mitigating negative declaration was really where we analyzed the incentives that are included in the ACAP and then how that played out into our future built out, revitalized Artesia aviation corridors. And so, and that even included, we assumed these parking flexibility options would also incentivize the future restaurant and office development that we proposed or that we anticipate. And then the next bullet is really about tonight's initial study and environmental determination. And if you look through the document, it determined after a pretty extensive analysis, there'd be no environmental impacts. And therefore, a negative declaration has been prepared, and that's for this body to act on tonight as well. And then with that, we have our recommendation that the Planning Commission adopt the resolution by title before you tonight. And Greg said you have some other options as well, always. That concludes my presentation. And if you want to go back to that other slide, we'll entertain questions. And we have, again, the consultants are here tonight to answer any specific questions that get a little more technical.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sure everyone up here has some questions for you. I have some questions just to lead off, just in case, because I don't see any hands raised. I'm sure there will be in a second. You mentioned relaxing for this particular, I'll just call it a district, this particular area, the parking requirements, but no other places in the city have that kind of relaxation. What are if somebody's building, or they built Rockefeller just a couple of years ago in Riviera Village, what are the parking requirements in Riviera Village when you're renovating or putting in a new store, restaurant right there in the row and such?
Yeah, it's interesting. Those lots are so constrained.
Yeah.
And the zoning in the village is C2 PD, C4 PD. And with that designation, as long as that restaurant is less than 2,000 square feet, it's parked at what we're proposing tonight, a 1 per 300 rate. So we're allowed to, which is, less than some of the retail. So you can see a retail, as long as it's less than 2,000 square feet, flip to a restaurant, and they're limited to 30 indoor seats. And then they get that 12 outdoor and, or 25%, but it'd be 12 outdoor that they get. And they can meet the parking requirement of 1 per 300.
Okay, so each one of those restaurants in Riviera Village has dedicated parking somewhere?
Well, I mean, then we're talking about legal nonconforming issues, and that's kind of what's predominantly happening there. So, so for example, that what I was describing with the retail space, going to a restaurant's okay as long as it's less than 2,000 square feet, because it's a lesser parking generator than the retail at 1 per 250. So So they could make that with no parking there, right? So it's legal nonconforming. They're not intensifying the nonconformity, so we're allowed to approve it.
Okay. Well, and I guess, when, so am I correct in interpreting this as sort of like a short-term interim step to where we're trying to go ultimately with this area in terms of?
I mean, it's certainly a first step. Interim really depends on kind of that follow-up that may be needed if we determine, hey, we're having those unintended consequences, the phone's ringing, or we do a survey and we determine that, wow, there's a lot of cars coming off the corridor into those neighborhoods. We need to bring this back and look at some of these initiatives and maybe tighten them up.
Are we working with a longer term vision of what we want this to look like ultimately? If we actually successfully revitalized it the way that each of us probably has a different picture in the back of their head of what this would look like if we truly succeeded, right?
Yeah.
I would also chime in and say that city council's given us direction to look beyond that FAR increase that we just did from 0.5 to 0.6. The idea is to go all the way up to 1.5, which is a significant raise, right? But what they're thinking and what we're working on is having some incentives along the way to do parcel aggregation.
Sure.
So, you can get a 1.5 if you do X, Y, and Z and get a bigger area and actually, we're not talking about, little modifications here or there or creating outdoor dining. We're talking about wholesale, mid-block, brand new buildings, at which point, you could probably do underground parking. There's room for the ramps. And it's just a whole different animal.
Right. And so I'm just thinking, I'm glad so I was thinking through different models of what this could be if we truly succeeded. And I'm glad this subject of Riviera Village has come up because it sort of fits this model that I'm thinking of, and that is, Beverly Hills in the triangle, Rodeo, Cannon, Beverly, streets like that are, restaurant intensive, retail intensive, and yet what everything is dependent upon is public parking. And they very wisely have, parking garages every block or two. First 2 hours are free. And the subsequent times are very reasonable and such. And this is probably the most successful retail / restaurant place in certainly the West Coast of the US. There may be places in New York City that are more successful, perhaps, but I think everyone would agree it's extremely successful. The rents are outrageous in that area, and they have mobs of shoppers and things like that. And nobody's looking to pull up to a place there and park in the dedicated parking lot for one of those establishments. You know what I mean? They're all, and everything is pretty low friction. And I was working in Culver City when they revitalized their downtown. Again, the model was, put in a bunch of public parking, and they were able to put this enormous, parking ramp behind some buildings by the hospital and stuff like that. And the businesses just, popped up because everybody had a place to park. People could go there knowing they'd be able to park. It would be inexpensive and a short walk to their destination. Downtown Hermosa Beach, I was there when they closed off Pier Avenue. I was living in that area. And part of that was a parking ramp. And, with the intention of building a second one that hasn't been built yet. But public parking was really key part of what has worked for those very, very successful retail restaurant areas and such. And so just glancing at a map there, the idea is, and I understand the lots are narrow, they're shallow, they're narrow, but I'm wondering if we have an eye towards, as a city, when those some of those might become available for one reason or another, that might be suitable to put in a public parking garage, and we would just pounce on the deal and do it, and eventually perhaps have, one every block or two of these public parking ramps that would then, we could literally let people build restaurants there without any parking. Why? Because there's already parking a half a block away.
Right.
But anyway, don't mean to make this a brainstorming session or something like that, but I was wondering whether this fit in a context of something like that. And I have spoken for a little over 4 minutes, probably toward 5.
That's so good.
I see Commissioner Lamb, so I'm going to call upon her and Commissioner Light after that.
Just a clarifying question here. It's got a couple of parts. Just specifically what the role of the Planning Commission is tonight. And just to confirm, in a discussion earlier, one question is, do we agree to change the parking ratios? Do we think that's a good idea for the seating and the office restaurant ratios? That's, I was hearing from Greg that that's one of the issues that they would like to hear on. Do we agree that creating options for a use permit is of value? And is it appropriate? Do we like the performance standards? Also, we're here tonight to approve the resolution to add amendments to the general plan land use element. Am I correct?
No,
No. Okay.
only the zoning ordinance.
Okay, I was reading the resolution. Are we not approving the resolution? I was thinking I heard that we were going to approve the resolution.
The
No.
resolution is a recommendation to city council. So
Right.
you'll be approving the resolution that's before you, but that decision is just a recommendation to city council of the following. You agree with staff 100%, you agree with some changes, or you don't.
Okay, just for clarification, in the resolution, it says, it identifies amendments to the land use element. Are we not?
There is mention of the general plan in the title to make consistent, these changes will make the general plan, zoning ordinance, and the ACAP consistent with one another. But we're only proposing to amend the zoning ordinance with respect to the parking regulations.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. I believe I was looking at the wrong resolution.
All right, Commissioner Light.
Yeah, and reading over the materials beforehand and hearing this, I only saw one reference tonight to paying for parking there. Is that part of the flex? Because paid parking has a whole other layer of things to it. I know you want to encourage people to walk and bike there, and paid parking will incentivize that. It will disincentivize those who don't like to pay for parking. So where does that fit into all of this planning? Because it does make sense that if you're going to build parking structures, if it starts revitalizing, then the paid parking makes more sense. If you start with paid parking, it seems to me to be the opposite effect.
For the most part, actually, for everything that we're proposing tonight is in relation to required on-site parking that a developer or a business owner must provide to the public, to the patrons that are coming to his establishment. Those cannot be, charged, essentially. They've got to provide them. It's got to be free. The pay for that has been kind of coming up is more of a long-term solution that City Council absolutely grappled with. It was option one, was, essentially to just build a bunch of parking structures. Option 4, which is this flexibility one, when we went to the community, it was pretty split evenly between 1 and 4 on which one was preferred. Council considered both pretty heavily, parking garages being so expensive and us being such, at the beginning of this process, decided to go with option 4. As the commission alluded to, as time goes on, we would have to purchase land and construct parking garages. We would likely purchase land, then do a surface lot for a little while, then build a parking garage because they're so expensive. as they grappled that, they said, by the time we get there, parking's transforming today as we speak in terms of how it's being applied, how the demand's being done, Uber, autonomous vehicles. As we get there, it might change. So let's do this first.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Commissioner Hensley.
Yep. Thank you, Chair. So I had a couple questions when it comes to the environmental part of it. So again, we're making changes to the municipal code. I do see in the resolution that it references the general plan, but that's already been approved, those changes, right? So we're verifying that what we're proposed, or what's proposed for the municipal code matches those changes to the general plan, or at least is consistent with, maybe not matches, not the right word. And on June 1st, I think it was, this planning commission looked at the ACAP in more broadly, or the ACAP FAR ratio change, or preferred uses. Maybe can you go through the difference between what was previously, and I know you did at the beginning, but just, and what part of tonight's activity was in there and what is not, right? Like, so when this environmental study says no impact for everything, I couldn't find anything that didn't say no impact. And I saw the same response repeated a lot in all the things. So I'd like to just a little more clarity on why there's no impact to these changes and why basically the same answer is repeated repeatedly.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so a couple of points. Again, the issue areas that are subject to CEQA with respect to transportation now don't include parking. They don't include trips generated, level of service. So I just want to make that clear. So it's a very different analysis that you do with respect to transportation in this CEQA document. And the difference, and then, just segueing over to what we did before, and what from this action tonight was kind of assumed when we did that analysis in order to realize that analysis in a tangible way to measure the potential impact. So, because the broader activation of the ACAP included, so all the future development, one of the zone changes for that last action was all future developments must be consistent with the intents and recommendations and design guidelines in the ACAP. So, that's kind of one element, and included in the ACAP are all these parking recommendations. So that was kind of, tangential to that, but really where that ACAP activation initial study became, kind of picked up this project was because we had to somehow figure out what that looked like. And we had to assume all the incentives in the ACAP, including these, were actually implemented. And then that would generate, more development. We assumed, the FAR increase. We assumed ground floor office. We assumed, reducing from CUP to AUP, the outdoor dining and restaurants. And we assumed, hey, we're going to have flexible parking because that's strongly recommended in ACAP. And we assumed all that in order to generate some tangible change that represented a revitalized ACAP. And then we split that between our two preferred uses, restaurants and office. And when we did all that work, we came up with about, we worked hard on trying to figure it out. And we came up with about 36,000 square feet of new restaurant and office, if everything, with the activation of ACAP could be built, or potentially could be built. And then that's what we analyzed in that prior initial study document, because we were activating ACAP. So what we're doing tonight was another one of those incentives that fed into that determining that build out number. And that's what we analyzed. And so that was for that. And then for this, there's nothing really left other than looking at the finite potential direct and indirect physical changes that could occur with the implementation of these changed parking regulations. And so you're reducing a parking requirement. That really, there's really no impact from that in a physical sense, directly or indirectly, that we are aware of now. Same with tandem parking and valet parking. You're just moving cars on a parking lot. Mechanical lifts, there could be some potential physical, impacts. So we've got, if you notice, when we look at mechanical lifts, they've got to be screened from view from the street. There has to be an attendant. And then we have mitigation built in to the project that essentially would say, if there's any issues, we're going to have further conditions on this. So the project then kind of self-mitigates, so there's no impact. The project has been changed to incorporate any potential issues. So we were left with, hey, we don't see anything as a result of this, that what we're proposing isn't internally taken care of, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, there's other mitigation measures that say whatever studies they produce, they've got to show that there's no on-site or off-site circulation issues. So if you do have a valet area, where you drop your car off can't be on the driveway because who's coming up behind you, right? You've got to mitigate all this in your study before administratively we look at it, or if it gets to this level before you look at it.
But this document had no mitigation measures in it.
Right. So it's a really subtle distinction because now the project itself includes mitigation. So you're not requiring to add mitigation because of an impact that the project hasn't assessed and incorporated, if that makes sense.
Got it. Okay. So am I okay on time?
Yeah, Commissioner Godek is after you.
I'm a little confused on why these weren't all taken as one, why wasn't this all looked at as one action, and why is it?
Yeah, well, we needed more time to figure out the parking. So it trailed, and it was a separate contract by council.
Yeah, to be honest, this was always, at least with council's directions, two separate kind of projects in general. And as they've moved together, they've gotten closer and closer in timeline because one gets delayed and the other one maybe doesn't hit as many delays. And here we are a month apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my very next question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Nope,
Go
that
ahead,
was it.
and then we'll, do you have some more after
Yeah,
Madison?
no, that was my question. And just to confirm, in the action we're taking tonight, in the environmental initial study, there was no impact for any of the studied areas. Is that correct?
Correct.
So not even like minimal impact or no impact with mitigation. It was no impact for every studied area, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Godek.
So the parking, do we know about how big the average restaurant is in this corridor? How many square feet?
Yeah. It's a tough one.
A range?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a number of small restaurants, less than 2,000 square feet, because those are the only ones that could kind of move in with the constrained parking situations. And then we've got, a couple larger that are kind of been there forever and legal non-conforming with respect to parking in the 3,000 to 4,000. And then just the new one that was approved that I think comes in at about 8,000 to 10,000.
Okay. So like a 48,000 square foot restaurant under the 75 feet requiring a parking spot would require 4,800. What did I say?
48. Big restaurant.
4,800 square foot, thank you. Would require 64 spaces at 75 feet, one per 75 feet, and at the new requirement would only require 16. So if we're going to be having a lot of larger scale restaurants, that's going to end up adding up to a lot of fewer spaces than we would have.
One more time, I'm sorry. I did get confused with yeah, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
4,800 square foot restaurant, if you have to provide one spot per 75 feet, you would have to provide 64 spaces.
Okay.
If you have to provide one spot for 300 square feet, it's 16.
Okay.
So it's a significant difference in the number of spaces. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of
contemplation of putting a cap, or like maybe having some sort of, if you're over 5,000 square feet, then maybe it's a different number, or, I'm just worried about if we're talking about upsizing some of these lots and everything else, that we're going to have some, we already have a 10,000 square foot. So if we have really big restaurants, they're not going to be providing a lot of parking.
I mean, certainly something to consider for this group, absolutely. I think Sean is looking up the requirement right now.
Yeah, so we've got 6 different categories of parking, so.
Not one size fits all.
Of restaurant. So we end up really playing with this when applicants come in. The most conservative is that 1 per 75.
Okay.
We usually will usually fall back on some of the other categories that allow us to base it on the number of seats or the square footage of the actual dining area. So we get a lot more creative. It's pretty rare we actually end up at that 1 per 75 gross floor area.
Also add just neighboring jurisdictions up and down California, it's pretty rare when you have 6 different restaurant categories in one municipal code. And I will say it's very common for the parking ratio to be based just on the dining area, and they don't penalize the restaurant for the kitchen and the back of house stuff. So for the most part, if you had a 4,800 square foot typical restaurant, you'd probably assume about half of that's back of house. So, 1 to 75, if you're using the worst parking ratio, it would get to like 30 or so.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Commissioner Boswell.
So on this 4,800 square foot example, it's kind of hard to figure out just what parking a restaurant like that would need. Do you have a formula that tells us how many seats a typical 4,800 square foot restaurant would be? And that seems to be where we should be looking first to determine what kind of parking is actually going to be needed for such average restaurant.
Well, I think when it comes to kind of these flat ratios, we look at what's working, right? We're looking at Riviera Village, which has a similar ratio. We're looking at similar jurisdictions just to kind of get a barometer. Say somebody can't meet this parking requirement. They've got to provide some kind of a parking study that shows what their anticipated demand is. That's where, on a case-by-case basis, this restaurant says, your requirement's too strict. I'm showing you with this study that it should be 1 to 400 or 1 to 450. And it's up to staff if it's an AUP, or this commission if it's a CUP, or if it gets to this commission with other entitlements, to believe that or not, to look at that study and say, yes, that has merits, or no, it doesn't, and to approve it or deny it. So when it comes to the flat ratio, we're using best practice. When it comes to the case by case, we're looking at a very specific independent study.
So is there a ratio?
1 to 300?
That's the parking. Okay, what about how many seats will be in a 4,800 square foot restaurant on average? Is there a formula that you work with to say, well, 4,800 square foot restaurant's going to have, 100 seats. So that means maybe 40 or 50 cars. Do we really want to say that, well, that restaurant really only needs to provide 20 parking spaces? So just throwing out numbers here. So without an understanding of how many seats are in an average restaurant of a particular size, how do we estimate how much parking they're going to take up on Artesia or in parking lots around the restaurant or behind the restaurant?
I hear you.
How do we even know?
I hear you,
How
but
can we make an intelligent assessment of that?
I do think design of the building has a lot to do with how many seats you can get in there as well. And that's why we use a square footage ratio instead.
So it doesn't matter how many seats they have. It's just based on square footage. And then if they don't qualify, they can come back and say, we think that you should allow us anyway, and here's why.
Exactly.
And then you will say, come back with some better numbers, or hey, that works for us.
Right.
Okay, so it doesn't matter. So somebody that has a large area restaurant, but a small number of seats, could easily convince you that it's okay for them to move in as a restaurant. What happens 2 or 3 years later when they say, we're not making enough money, we need more seats? Can they just add more dining area?
And maybe Marta can chime in on these parking studies. A simple floor plan that shows 20 tables where 100 could fit would not suffice as a parking study that shows that they don't need they don't need as many parking spaces. It's a little more complicated than that.
Okay, so we need to understand that.
Yeah, I'll also say hello. Nice to meet you all. I'll say that
State your name and,
my name is Marta Polovin and I'm with Fair and Pierce.
okay, thank you.
I'll just say that just for some context of restaurant uses, Beverly Hills requires 1 per 300 square feet for their restaurants, just as a point of comparison. And a lot of the parking ratios that we determine are based on from the ULI, the Urban Land Institute, and it's an institute that collects data nationally for all kinds of different restaurants. And so they basically find like a family restaurant and then they record what's the parking demand of that restaurant at its like peak performance. And then they come up with some ratios to determine to right size it. And then that's how they come up with their number. But all of these are based on square footage, but also the type of restaurants across the whole country. So these numbers are not necessarily pulled from, thin air, but they're pulled from verified studies done by transportation professionals.
And so everybody deals with this on a basis of square footage as opposed to tables.
Yes, generally, but there's different types. But for example, like a fine dining restaurant, you might not necessarily it might be different than a family restaurant, right? The amount of tables that are generally crammed in there. But that's how we group it to understand what is the appropriate parking ratio. And also, I will add that for the parking estimates that we derived for those future analyses, we picked the restaurant use with the highest parking demand, which was fine dining, to come up with that ratio.
So Beverly Hills has a 1 to 300 ratio, but also has all those lovely public parking garages on every block that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah,
So
I'd
we
be
don't-
interested in how they reconcile all that. But I have
Yeah.
a feeling maybe as they do in Riviera Village, where it's non-conforming,
And I might add, we have, as we know from our parking utilization survey, we've got a lot of unused street parking that I'm sure Beverly Hills doesn't have. So it's not apples to apples.
in the
but
ACAP.
Well, I was kind of referring to, I think Commissioner Kodak was referencing, hey, well, they can have a 1 per 300 because they have all these public parking garages, right?
Exactly.
We don't have garages, but we've got a very underutilized street parking environment. So that does give us some room if we, let's say, have a less conservative parking generation rate. So that's kind of what has gone into how we came up with the numbers.
So
Yes.
So, do I understand it correctly that in Beverly Hills, restaurants don't have their own parking lots? They rely on these block by block public parking that the city has
It
provided?
depends on where you're talking about in Beverly Hills.
So are there restaurants in Beverly Hills in that triangle that you mentioned that have their own parking lots?
Probably.
Valet parking, they have parking garages.
But I'm
they
asking
have
about parking lots
lots
because
on the street.
the one spot per 300 square feet implies that they're responsible for coming up with a parking space.
Yeah.
So if they don't have a parking lot, and if there's all these parking structures available, why is that even an issue for them? I'm wondering why they have a ratio at all.
Well, let's just for sake of argument, a vacant lot becomes available or there's a demolition and it's a new restaurant being developed on a property. They would have to meet that 1 per 300 rate and provide some
If you
on-site
scraped a
parking.
lot and you're building a restaurant, you are required to have a parking lot for that
Yes,
restaurant.
yes.
Whether it's behind it, under it, or whatever.
Exactly.
But if there's a new, if a restaurant such as a very beloved deli on Beverly Drive near Little Santa Monica that was recently closed, if that closes and they open a new restaurant there, it basically can take over the non-conforming nature of the prior restaurant that was there.
Most likely.
Okay.
Yes.
And most of those blocks have either been retail or restaurants for a very, very long time.
Yes.
So that's basically what's going on there.
Yeah, there's a lot of legal nonconforming turnover and preservation of those legal nonconforming rights that perpetuate. But, the 1 per 300 in Beverly Hills is anybody new coming in that's building, a new facility on a property, they're going to have to meet that.
Okay, Commissioner Hazeltine.
Really simple question. I would like to point out, though, the parking garages that we're talking about, the public parking in Beverly Hills at lunchtime are full. So that's like a whole nother realm. That's not artesian aviation. Really simple question, valet parking. How do they keep the parking off the residential areas? So we have aviation and artesia parking spaces, but how would we guarantee that that would not flow over into the neighborhoods?
I can take that one. So when we talk about valet parking, it would still have to be on the site of the restaurant or whatever the use is that's
Right.
incorporating the valet. So it wouldn't spill over onto the street. It wouldn't, like the valet professional driver wouldn't be taking the car around the corner. It'd have to be on the site. What we're capturing is when you design a parking lot, there's minimum length and width and handicap
Okay.
accessibility, striping, that then limits how many cars you can put on there. But as soon as you hand your keys over to professional and you're not the one navigating that, all that goes out the window and they can stack the cars as much as they want. So
Got it.
there is a finite number of what they could fit, but it's a lot more.
Okay.
And just to follow up on her question just a little bit, in some of these valet parking situations, they make a deal with some business that is closed at night. Their parking lot's full during the day, but the business is closed, and so the parking lot is empty. And so they make a deal with that business that they can use their parking at night.
Yep.
So that's how the restaurants.
And you're
pull it
talking
off.
about one business taking advantage of two of our options, which you have valet and shared. So that's a possibility. They could take a couple of these options and have a study that shows why a combination of all of them works. It's all case by case, creativity here.
Okay.
Commissioner Hensley.
I have a question in that same realm. It was mentioned earlier about the underutilized on-street parking. If a new business, we'll just assume restaurant, because everyone's talking about restaurants, shows up and they say, okay, this is what I want to build, and I have my study and it says I need 20 parking spots, right? And I can provide 10 of them on my site. Can they ever say like my other 10 are on the street? No. So it has to be valet or shared or something, right? So then I'm a little, maybe not confused, but like, then how does the underutilized street parking help us, I guess, or like, how is it used in this situation if we can't use it? Like,
Yeah, I mean, we can't credit them for it, but it does provide, a buffer.
It's a luxury.
Yeah, it's just some capacity we know is there. We're not taking, it was one of the things we discussed though, I've worked at jurisdictions where, the street parking, they do get some credits, with some, let's say the street frontage has 4 or 5 spaces, they get to utilize those to meet their own parking requirements. We didn't go that route here. It's just not what we're pursuing, but it is nice to have that because that'll be the first option rather than the neighborhoods to the rear.
okay. I have some other questions in a different area. Other commissioners?
Yeah, you have plenty of time.
I don't know, but before there's other parking or.
I do have a follow-up actually to your question. That is, so we have some parking in the Edison right-of-way that we're using now. Do we, and that sort of serves a little bit, it's not located exactly, in the busiest part of that area, but it does give us a little bit of a buffer. Do we have any more potential in that right-of-way of expanding sort of that buffer type of parking there?
Right.
Yeah. We're not aware of any plan currently, but it is there. There could be, if that could be, that'd probably be the cheapest, next step if we need more public parking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And you're about to move on to another subject, and I ate up a little bit of your time there. Sorry about that. You're after Matt. Matt's not done.
Oh, no, but.
Oh, would you, is that on the same thread of this parking as Matt was on?
No.
No, okay. Okay, Matt's going to change the subject now.
Okay. Question on the process of the AUP and the special conditions process in general. So when I read through the code changes, it basically looks like if they do Well, let me pause. Can I get a high-level overview of how the process works? Like when it comes to AUP versus CUP and special parking when an applicant comes with a project?
Yeah, it's actually not an AUP, but yeah. So yeah, the administrative use permit, it's procedurally, there's notifications that occur, and there's criteria. There's just a handful of criteria that has to be met. So we, would take in the application, confirm it has all the information we need to determine if it meets the criteria, route that to other departments, particularly Public Works with their, they're going to look at some potential adjacent, infrastructure requirements that may come into play, but, that's just a normal thing that we do. There could be some impact, low impact design or development, kind of our SUSUMP requirements could get kicked in depending on, restaurant uses. They typically have a little higher standard, but anyway, and then we analyze that, those application materials, the plans, the studies that are incorporated or included with the application, and then again, notice it. If there's no feedback from the public, if the public doesn't request additional information or a hearing, then the community development director looks at what staff has put together in terms of an approval document and any conditions, and then confirms, whether or not that she can approve the project. And if it's approved, a notification is sent to the property owner. I think there's an appeal process as well, potentially, that then could, depending on some decision by the applicant or potentially an adjacent neighbor, it could get appealed to this body.
Okay, and for the overlap parking, is there a process that goes along with that for the administrative design review, or is the overlap parking, if they want to use offsite, they want to use their neighbor's parking lot, is that within that process you just explained, or is that a separate process if they want to do it?
The shared parking, we have that in our code currently. This is just kind of
Adding to.
Yeah, or a watering down of it slightly. As instead of requiring a recorded document and covenant against the adjacent, the property that's providing the additional parking, we just need a lease and agreement between the parties that's approved by the city attorney, which we think is going to be a lot easier for people to get. Having an adjacent, a nearby property actually record a covenant against their property, preserving your parking needs I don't even know if we have one. We might have one. There's one down in the village.
It's a deterrent for whoever's the one doing the favor, essentially, right?
Yeah, they're like, I'd like to help you, but I'm not going to record a covenant against my property,
Okay. And let's say that if they do shared parking or they do offsite or they have that agreement and city attorney signs off, what happens if when that project comes to fruition doesn't work like we thought, or some unintended consequence happens, or some traffic jam, occurs every Friday night at 5 o'clock? What's I won't say unwinding, but how do we fix that? How do we resolve that?
The community development director, if you look at the last bullet, we can allow, or the community development director would basically call to question that approval and, begin to investigate what the issues are, and then, amend that administrative use permit with additional conditions to deal with whatever the nuisance might be.
Okay. I'm almost done, if that's okay. So when I read on the shared parking, it says that administratively, they can basically modify, amend, or terminate the agreement, that shared parking. And then basically AUP is we can put more conditions. Is there a reason that there's maybe inequity? Like one of them, we can only put more conditions, but it doesn't say we can cancel it. It doesn't say we can terminate it. It doesn't say we can reject the AUP. We can just add conditions to try to mitigate But the shared parking says that we can modify, amend, or unilaterally terminate the agreement.
Well, the administrative use permit can be revoked, but I'd have to double check that.
Okay. Okay, let me look and read a little more, and then I'll come back. And
Okay.
follow. Thank you.
Commissioner Lamb?
So some of my questions have already been answered. Thank you so much. So for clarification, this is really a first step. Is that correct? We talked about what happens if things change, more restaurants come, and that there is a component, an evaluative component embedded in this process. Am I correct about that?
You're correct. You got to look at this as an economic incentive to try to get the ball rolling here.
This is just getting the ball rolling,
Yeah.
right? We're going to, and you're adding 2 sections to the parking regulations, is that correct? 2 sections to 10-2.1700, 2 sections only, really. And if in the future there's, as Matt sort of talked about, any kind of changes, there's going to be a regular evaluation component so you can review.
Correct.
What, 2 more questions here. One is, what are you projecting in terms of change in a span of years as a result of implementing these proposals?
What we expect is about up to 36,000 more square feet of kind of rentable space here. In terms of how fast we expect this to kind of take off, I think the market's going to dictate. We don't really know, We're hoping that all these little things that we're doing will accumulate into an effect where the vacancy rate goes down and we've got more pedestrian-oriented, kind of lively uses out there.
10 years, 20 years? Or is that not possible at this point in time?
It's hard to peg a time. I mean,
That's a really interesting question. GPAC wrestled with this a little bit in terms of, when we came up with the 0.5 to 0.6, and a lot of it had to do with, well, what's going to happen at the Galleria? We think that's going to really go, and then that could generate some energy and really start to create some synergy on the corridor. And now we're seeing like Grub House coming in. I really think personally that's going to create some energy. So, it could change more quickly than we might think, depending on, when Galleria's, they're getting permits, as we speak, and that could really create a lot of energy. And then you got Grub House coming in one of our activity nodes, and that could really start to spark some interest. So it's hard to gauge, but we've got 2 things happening on Artesia that are gonna, I think, start really creating some revitalization.
yeah, and I'd say, we're dealing with a vacancy kind of issue here too. So what we're doing here is making it easier for these restaurants to move in and office spaces to move in. So you would think, without having to do any improvements or anything, just simply moving in and doing some TIs to convert the space to a kitchen or whatever you got to do, that's a whole lot easier than developing enough space for more parking or building underground parking garages or whatever they would normally have to do to meet parking requirements. So I would say, in that sense, that being kind of the easiest route, within 5 years, we'll hopefully see
So that's a reasonable,
Yeah.
You're looking at a reasonable period of time to be for some synergistic change.
I think so.
5 years. One question is, how many, over the last year, how many potential offices and/or restaurants have you had to turn down due to the parking?
Just in the last year, I know of 2, one office, and I know of a restaurant that we had to say no to.
I think In the course of the time I've been here, I'd say it's more than a handful. Just I can think of one site that we've turned down, probably 3 just on one site, just because of whether it was the office and it was only one level, or just that they weren't going to be able to meet the parking.
Right, so there's a cumulative effect of that also, right? When the word gets out that this street isn't really habitable, right? And you're hoping that within a 5-year period that the word's going to get out and that the folks are going to start to come back and or it'll start to that slow regeneration.
And it helps that as well, a lot of the brokers and real estate agents already know that this is a hindrance.
Yeah.
So once this is adopted, we can certainly make sure that they know that there's a change. I mean, I'm sure they're all watching. A lot of them were a very big part of the, participated a lot in the public process on the ACAP. But certainly, this has been a real difficult situation for them as well, trying to help get a property sold or leased out. Yeah.
Right. And in terms of the parking, of the options that you are providing here, these flexible, the off-site valet, tandem, mechanical lifts, which do you think, from what you're hearing from people, right, your experience and maybe some of the real estate folks, which of these flexible offerings do you believe is going to be the first choice?
Well, yeah, I've got some experience here. So I would say it's probably a tie between valet, tandem, and offsite. I would say mechanical lifts would be probably the lowest option just because there's a cost associated with that. Not that offsite doesn't have a cost. I'm sure there's a transaction that occurs when you agree to accommodate other cars, but valet and tandem are probably the low hanging fruit for somebody to first check to see what they can do, and then they kind of elevate it from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
If I may, Chair, real quick, I wanted to go back to Commissioner Hensley's question about the AUP process. So the AUP can be appealed, and it would be appealed to the Planning Commission. So if that were granted, that could happen. As well, it's revocable, and it's one of the points of what could trigger it being revoked is the exercise of the rights under the approval constitutes a nuisance. So, we're recognizing that, something may happen. We have that a lot on the Planning Commission resolutions. I'm sure you've seen those. Similarly with the AUP, it's good that we have that. And then there are other things that for how it could be revoked if it was obtained under fraud or misrepresentation, other things. But the biggest one and the most easy to demonstrate would be that nuisance.
Sorry, can I confirm something?
Is that a follow-up to?
Just a confirmation.
Sure.
The typical language that I've seen with that is like, if it's determined to be a nuisance as determined by the community development director, is that, or is it just if it's a nuisance?
Typically, a nuisance is going to be determined by code enforcement.
Okay.
And, there's a process that we go through to determine something's a nuisance. Yeah.
Okay, that was my clarification.
Okay. Do we have any public comments before we go to Commissioner Boswell here? Do we have any public comments on this or any speakers?
Yes,
on
we
this?
have
asking that I
two
not
two e-comments.
You have 2 e-comments. Okay.
From Brianna Egon, she supports it, so she's mentioned, I broadly support the proposed zoning ordinance amendments for parking with the ACAP. Given the vast oversupply of parking in the district, it's a great idea to streamline parking regulations across all uses, allow for overlap/shared parking, and increase allowable outdoor dining seats. Reducing costly parking mandates is a proven way to encourage business investment and foot traffic in commercial areas. See the work of Parking Reform Network and UCLA Professor Donald Shoup. The staff report references sections in the ACAP that describe strategies where businesses can replace vehicle parking with bicycle parking. Can we codify this in a zoning ordinance amendment at this time? For example, LA City Municipal Code Section 12.21.A.4 states that new or existing automobile parking spaces required by the code for all uses may be replaced by bicycle parking at a ratio of 1 automobile parking space for every 4 bicycle parking spaces provided. Notwithstanding the foregoing, no more than 20% of the required automobile parking spaces for non-residential uses shall be replaced at a site. Perhaps this can be used as a framework. Looking further at the parking implementation plan, I would like to express strong support for the strategies of shared parking and parking benefit districts. A new parking surface lot or garage would be unnecessarily costly to the city and not needed at this time. Parking benefit districts are a proven strategy to increase investment in commercial districts and incentivize parking turnover and on-street parking spots by using meters. Additionally, I think it is vitally important that the city explore a residential parking permit program for the neighborhoods surrounding the ACAP to preserve on-street parking for residents and reduce unintended parking spillover to neighborhoods. That was from Brianna Egon. The next one is from Jerome Chang, who supports it. The commissioned parking study showed many idled, unused parking spaces. In addition, some buildings are essentially hoarding their spaces, which makes sense to be attractive for current and future commercial tenants. However, mixing occupancies, retail by day versus restaurants, bar at night, with diurnal parking usage, daytime versus evenings, or even also weekends, would greatly maximize parking spaces and avail more floor area toward new building developments. This all supports Councilperson Obaji's push for the higher FAR, which I also support. Increasing sidewalk width and in some areas create bulb outs will reduce car traffic and their speeds. The net results will be a safer and pedestrian-centric boulevard. I would also advocate for safe bike lanes to share this new boulevard design. On the note of offices, many downtowns have historically disallowed this occupancy. I would generally agree except for newer office types such as co-working spaces that maintain or increase foot traffic relative to retail/restaurant. In the end, foot traffic should be the goal, not necessarily antiquated definitions of occupancies. To be clear, especially with low percentage utilization of office space post-pandemic, I would discourage traditional office occupancies on the ground floor. Pre-pandemic, they would not have contributed to a pedestrian/high foot traffic vibe, but now they've contributed even less to the point of deteriorating this vibe. Finally, please add/include trees along the street to attract pedestrian flow and provide shade for outdoor dining.
All right. Any other public comments? Okay. Commissioner Boswell.
What was my question? So just to make sure I'm understanding how adjustments would be made down the road, it appears as though early on, the incentive for entrepreneurs to create restaurants and offices on Artesia is because they've got this very favorable parking situation, which is not going to get any better, but over time may get more restrictive, right? So as you're finding that parking is not quite so available, maybe shifting from 1 space for every 300 square feet, it would go to 1 space for every 200 square feet or 100. Is that how you would, is that one of the ways that you would address?
I mean, that would be one option, right? We'd explore everything. I mean, permit parking, like someone said, if we saw the spillover, maybe we'd implement one of those. We'd take a look at, the study that was done by a group like Fair and Peers and see what their recommendations would be, and go from there.
So as businesses are attracted to the redeveloping Artesia Boulevard and things start filling up, there's going to need to be changes. But what we're also going to see over a period of time is much more residential density in those neighborhoods, which already have insufficient parking. That additional density, especially when they're not required to have any extra parking, that's going to overflow onto Artesia and take up those free spaces, because where else are you going to park? So is that factored into determining how to adjust for this? Does it matter who's taking up the space, whether it's restaurants on Artesia or people living on Vanderbilt or, the other nearby streets that are finding it's the closest open spot to where they live?
Right, again, the on-street parking doesn't count in what we're kind of considering here. Like Sean said, it's kind of a buffer, it's kind of a freebie. It's probably where potentially employees would park so that whatever available spots they have on site would be reserved for customers. If I was a business owner, I would do stuff like that just to make sure my customer base was, the most comfortable. Likewise, if you're getting spillover from the neighboring residences, you could do a couple things. You could do the permit parking for the residences to make sure that the employees and the customers aren't going over there. You could put meters along Artesia to make sure that it's not financially feasible for the residents to park there for 48 hours. I mean, there's things you can do to offset that.
Could it be as easy as just having no overnight parking on Artesia to eliminate people who live in the area from parking there overnight? Or is that something that you might not want to inflict on?
I mean, if it became a problem and the study identified it, we would look into it for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds to me like you guys have got it pretty well thought out, and we've got a lot of excess capacity now. We can attract a lot of businesses before this has to get really serious. Is there something else that we should be worried about that we're not focusing on now?
Sean?
So there is, huh?
No.
I don't know if I should say this, but
Uh-oh.
we're kind of looking,
Hey now.
we're looking forward to having a little bit of a parking problem,
Yeah, I was
that
gonna
means we got things going, It should make Greg really happy to have all that economic
If we're back
activity.
trying to find ways to fix this,
That means we were successful.
I'm going to have a huge smile.
And that's
I was
great,
gonna
but
say the
what we
problem
don't
would
want to
be that it
have are a
doesn't
bunch of
work.
restaurants that then say, hey, all our parking is being taken up by people who live here. Now we're not getting, we can't
Yeah,
fill the
right.
tables like we used to. We're going out of business.
If it truly
What
becomes a
happens?
problem, I think you start looking at effective private-public partnerships to get those parking structures, those surface parking lots. You start really looking into in lieu fees. There's other avenues here where, it gets drastic. Believe me, I came from a jurisdiction that had in lieu fees, and it said, okay, Mr. Restaurant, you're normally required to have 20 stalls. You don't want to provide any. One option you have is to pay for all 20 of those stalls into a future parking garage, and those are equivalent to about 50 grand a pop. So
space.
50 grand times 20, we'll
Okay.
take the check, and when we have enough money, we'll build a parking garage. It's that expensive. So, and they pay it.
And then they say, well, Torrance is looking better all the time.
But that's when there's a
So-
situation where everyone wants to be
So
here, right?
At some distant point, or maybe not so distant point, down the timeline, parking garages are an eventuality.
Potentially, but the reason why we didn't jump feet first into that is because times are
We don't
changing,
need to.
right? Yeah, it's
We don't need to, but,
Yeah.
but if we've got Artesia and aviation completely redeveloped, there's no vacant space. I mean, in the ultimate best case scenario down the road, there's just, and added to all of that robust business activity, we also have, 5,000 more residents in North Redondo.
right.
You're going to need parking structures, so I think we should certainly be looking at now, where are those going to be? And how are we going to acquire properties if what's available now isn't going to be sufficient? I mean, right now, if you look at Artesia, one of the larger parking areas is behind the post office. And that could certainly be, and I've been talking about this to people for years, that could certainly be a 4 or 5 story parking structure with a park on the top that could eventually become more parking if need be. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities. couple of floors underground. I mean, it could be something similar to what Hermosa Beach put next to the Pier Plaza when they redeveloped that.
Any
But
long-term
after
thoughts?
that, you're looking at, it really, the options slim down. You've got to be looking at buying property. So is that in the plan? Or should we add that to
Well,
the
it
plan?
is a future option. I mean, that ACAP includes
All of that.
so many, all the different strategies. What is it, the PID, what is that?
Parking improvement district.
Yeah, Parking Improvement District.
By the way, we're actually undergoing right now, and we're going door to door along the businesses to see if they want to create a bid that is a self-assessment that does go to something, right? Now, if they do that, they get to kind of decide what they spend that money on, but parking could be one of them. We can kind of, influence that a little bit maybe, but, so we're pursuing other, longer term solutions out there. And what Sean was kind of saying there was that, I think parking garages are the ultimate solution, right? But also the most costly. So it's as we keep going and as we become more and more of a success story, as a staff, we have to realize that, okay, which way are we headed here? What are the trends happening with parking? Are we at a point now where, parking garages aren't a good idea because of autonomous vehicles, for example?
That's right.
Maybe we're not quite there yet, and we do want to do a parking garage. So we're always going to be evaluating this vision that is the ACAP.
Okay, Commissioner Light.
Real quick, I also wanted to add to that the, that's where that annual report or
Absolutely.
whatever that time frame is that
Yeah.
the city council's looking to do, because that will help inform them. Then when is it triggering that we need to make an adjustment here?
Right.
When is it that we now really start looking at the properties that
What are
we
the
wanna
trends, right?
acquire, yeah.
And I guess the point that I don't want to get lost in the shuffle here is that there are parcels that might be good for a parking structure that we see now, and we need to make sure that that remains available and someone doesn't just, put a high-rise office building there. So we need to, I think we should determine now or in the near future where those parking structures should be and how we will make sure that they're still available in 10 or 15 years when we need them, or next year.
Okay, Commissioner Light.
Yeah, you kind of hit on the point I was going to make in response to the parking garage kind of concept. The future's changing very quickly now. People are birding around on those little things. They're bicycles more, autonomous vehicles and rideshare and all of that. So that seems to me those expensive options, which sounds like you've figured out. We're not going to jump on those. We're going to see and yearly evaluate what the need is. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, Commissioner Lamb.
Mr. Hensley, would you like to go first?
Was it your turn?
I have something specific, but please go first.
Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Inslee.
Yeah, I have a couple different questions. One of the public speakers talked about bike parking in lieu of car parking. Was that something that was considered? It seems like a low-cost item. Was that like,
What's the Z?
I hadn't thought of it or considered it.
That's actually something that it's on the to-do list of things to evaluate is bicycle parking and looking at regulations for that. It's not the top priority of projects, but it is something that the city council did take as an agenda item about a year ago, and that we do have on our list of things that we'll be evaluating in the community development department.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I remember that conversation. I think the interesting part here was the bike parking in lieu of car parking, right? If you required 10 spots, but you give them 8 bicycle spots, you can then only provide 9 and be, for example, and be compliant. So it was an interesting thought. I had a couple other questions. All throughout the municipal code, it talks about the community development director or a sign shall blah, 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 all the different times it's mentioned. Who exactly is envisioned for the or assigned part of that? Because I don't see that typically in other.
It's our plan. It could be the planner that's working on that particular project, but typically I will sign AUPs and administrative design review. So I will have reviewed it, but they're looking at that project and giving me that information. But typically I'm the one that's going to be signing that.
Typically, when you see an or designee, it's you know, it's always the director unless, you know, something happens and someone needs to sign on her behalf, you know?
Okay. And then my other questions are on mechanical lifts. So like I'm very familiar with valet parking or tandem parking or other things. I'm not so familiar with mechanical lifts, at least in this country. So when I looked through the municipal code and what's proposed, it talked about screening, but it was just screening from the street or screening from the street view. Was there any consideration of screening from the residential view, since usually you have backyards and houses right on the other side of those businesses? Like, is that an objectionable view? Is that something we think people might have concern about, or we don't?
I mean, we don't have a lot of experience with mechanical lifts. They're not very common. One location we are looking at them currently is down at the Legato Hotel. And with that, we created a screen wall between it and PCH. We looked at was there a way we could get some additional landscaping between that and the adjacent apartments. There was only a little area where we've maximized that opportunity. So we would look at, not only protecting, or shielding the view from the public right of way, that's required, but we're also going to look at those adjacent properties and see if we can get some landscaping in there. And another note is we haven't seen them any taller than just one space. So they're about 8 feet high or so. They'll only have one car above it. The car will go on it and lift up. But with the car, it's going to be up there. But we'd look to see if we can get some landscaping to help.
Okay. Yeah, that actually leads right into my next question. I didn't see any like maximum height or noise or anything about the lift itself. So is that our thought that like they only come in one car heights, or could someone propose a 4-car
They could,
mechanical lift?
it would have to meet the height regulation.
30 feet.
Yeah, so, and there's a setback requirement of 20 feet from the residential, adjacent residentially zoned property. So, we'd look at all those requirements, and it might not be something we could support depending on that adjacent use.
They're fairly common in San Francisco because of the tightness of the area.
Yes.
There's a lot of space here. I don't see that as critical here.
Sorry, one more question on that. So I envision this as replacing a parking spot on the ground, which basically means like at the property line. Would this have to meet a 20-foot setback requirement?
From the rear
From the
adjacent
rear?
zoned residential property, yes, because that'd be a structure.
Okay,
So
but that's not in the municipal code that we're looking at tonight. That's in a different part of the municipal code? Or is it here and I didn't see
It's
it?
just on the underlying zoning setback requirements, and those we're not changing.
Okay. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Lamb.
This was a very thorough conversation we've had. You have so much expertise here, a lot of details. Just want to thank you so much. This was, and we're excited about activating Artesia corridor. And so again, just thank you very much. You've communicated a very positive vision with this new flexibility with the parking. So I'm in support.
All right. Do we have any other questions for staff? Do we have any other public comments or questions?
I'd like to make a motion then to close the public hearing.
We have a second.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
That is a unanimous vote to close the public hearing. All right, any concerns, discussion before we move to a next step on this?
I really love that the annual assessments are built into this. It gives me a lot of comfort that there's not going to be anything that is going to create future problems.
And this is a recommendation to the city council, so. So do I have a motion?
Yes, you do. You have a motion to accept J1 as written by the staff.
by name only. Do we have a second on that?
Very friendly amendment.
Friendly?
Get the blue folder IS document.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. With the motion, we might need to address that there's a update to the initial study document with the blue folder item that identifies corrects the typo from the document that was in your package. So it'd be the updated mandatory findings of significance. Thank you.
I accept Commissioner Hensley's friendly motion.
Okay, then I'll second.
Okay, and do we have a second on the motion with the friendly?
I'll second.
All right, can we take a roll call vote on this?
Okay. Commissioner Light,
Aye.
Commissioner Boswell,
Yes.
Commissioner Godek,
Yes.
Commissioner Hazelton,
Yes.
Commissioner Hensley,
Yes.
Commissioner Lamb,
Yes.
Chair Gaddis.
Aye, and so this carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate you guys.
All right.
We'll now move on to
Good call.
to L1, which is a discussion item.
Gonna sit way
And actually, we have, it looks like we need to look at K, items continued from prior discussions before we move on to L. Do we have items continued from previous agendas?
There are no items continued.
Okay, so we'll move on to L. This is a discussion on City Council referral to Planning Commission to consider urgency ordinance 3226-21, amending the Redondo Beach Municipal Code Title 10, Chapters 1, 2, and 5 to provide objective standards for Senate Bill 9, that is, we'll refer to it as SB 9, by providing regulations related to urban lot splits and two-unit projects subject to Senate Bill 9, for Planning Commission to review City Council comments related to certain topics related to SB 9, and to provide feedback and other recommended revisions to be included as part of the implementation of a permanent ordinance pertaining to SB 9. And we have a staff discussion on this.
I'll start with a presentation, if you could share that. Great, thank you. So thank you, commissioners. With us tonight, we have Planning Manager Sean Scully. He'll be right back. And we also have our new Associate Planner, Victoria Banfield, and I wanted to welcome her. She actually has experience working with SB 9 in Saratoga, where she worked prior to coming here. So I have her working kind of in the background with me on this particular item. I'm going to go through a presentation. A lot of this we went over in February of last year, and we're bringing this back around now that we've kind of cleared our slate on a few other items. So a lot of this is going to be similar to that, but as well, we'll be providing an update on different things that the Department of Housing and Community Development has come out as far as these regulations. So the California Senate Bill 9, or SB 9, was signed into law by the governor in September of 2021 and became effective January 1st of 2022. SB 9 requires ministerial approval of subdivision of single-family zone parcels into two approximately equal parcels and the development of two residential units on a lot in those single-family zones, or it can be a combination of each. The new law allows local agencies to adopt objective standards to govern these types of projects, yet it also imposes restrictions on what agencies can actually require. And that's the balance that we'll be looking at. And this includes limits on what parking and setback requirements that we can put into place. The City Council first discussed the possible objective standards to address SB 9 in November and December of 2021. And the city council adopted an urgency ordinance at their December 21st, 2021 meeting. On January 18th, the council approved a report justifying the extension of the urgency ordinance. The initial urgency ordinance can only be effective for 45 days. You have to do this study in order to extend that. So they did then on February 1st of 2022, they extended the urgency ordinance to be effective for 2 years. And that's to provide this time for the Planning Commission to evaluate the effects of SB 9 and look at current and additional objective standards to include in the permanent ordinances. When I say ordinances, that's for both inland and coastal that we'll be adopting, whereas the urgency ordinance applies to both. The city council did refer this item to the Planning Commission for your consideration, including review of city council comments related to certain topics and to provide feedback on other recommendations that you might have for the permanent ordinance. On February 17th of 2022, I introduced this item to you. At that time, the state had not yet released a guidebook on how the municipality can implement or interpret those regulations. They have since. And I'll go into that a bit here. We have that direction from the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm just going to call it HCD, but just for reference and for those in the public that are watching. This presentation is a refresher about what I went over before regarding our urgency ordinance. I'll also reference it in as to what HCD has come out with their guidelines. We're going to also I'm going to start with the presentation. We can ask some questions tonight. Nothing needs to be decided as far as direction tonight. We're going to bring this back in August for further discussion. So this will, give you a month to really think about like what we've talked about, or are there additional things that you want to have considered to be added. And then what we'll do is finalize the ordinances, bring those back in September, or the resolution back in September for you to make a recommendation to council on the ordinances themselves. Okay, so HCD has weighed in considerably on what municipalities can do and cannot do, more so what they cannot do. So there are fewer options than what City Council had initially wanted to have the Planning Commission consider. So I'll advise you as best as I can if there are any of those recommendations that you put forward that might be counter to the HCD direction. Also, they've given a lot of feedback on our ADU ordinances and other regulations that, kind of inform what you'd expect for them to move forward with or question as far as SB 9 if we were to move forward with something. So I'll bring that to your attention as we go through any of the discussion items. So what is SB 9? SB 9 requires cities and counties, including charter cities, to provide for the ministerial approval of a housing development in a single-family residential zone that will split the lot and add a second home on the lot, or both. The new legislation eliminates discretionary review and public oversight of the proposed subdivision of a lot. Normally, a subdivision would come to the Planning Commission, and it takes that away in a single family if it's dividing it into two parcels. It removes the public notice requirements and hearings. Although it allows objective standards only to the limit where the units could be 800 square feet and still be developed on a lot or the resulting lot. The bill exempts SB 9 qualifying projects from environmental review required by CEQA. The bill also exempts a local agency from being required to hold public hearings for coastal development permit applications for housing developments and urban lot splits. Okay, so SB 9 allows lot splits. The basic allowances and limitations are it's got to be in a single family residential zone. It's a maximum of 2 parcels. The new lots need to be approximately equal in size. The minimum new lot size is 1,200 square feet. No location within a historic district or landmark historic property can have that split. The site cannot be, have been previously split, so it's not like somebody can split it and then split it until they can finally figure out an amount that would still be buildable. And each lot can have 2 residential units. For the 2 unit per lot projects, the ADUs and JADUs can be counted towards the maximum number of units if the lot is split. So if a municipality, chooses to add that in the ordinance, which we did for our urgency ordinance, and we would put that in the ordinances, you can require that. So what that means, so what you have is, if they choose to split the lots, and they can either have 2 principal residential dwellings, but if they decide to have an ADU on that split lot, that ADU counts as the second unit. So but if they don't split the lot, they can have the 2 principal units, they could have a JADU and they could have an ADU. So ultimately, I know that we have Holly Osborne. She has spoken on this topic multiple times from the public and had pointed out that they kept saying 4 means 4. So that's what they're talking about is if you split it, then only 2 units, period, on each of those lots. Now, we have to have that in our code that spells that out, that the ADUs and JADUs would count towards that. So depending on how they chose to mix that. And that if they chose not to split it, but they decided to put the 2 units, they could also still put the ADU and JADU, still only 4 on that lot. Okay. That was a lot just for that particular item, I know. Although it allows objective standards, like I said, only to the limit that 800 square feet can still be developed on a lot. Let's see, where am I at here? So each unit can be at least 800 square feet. No additional setbacks for existing structures can be required. No additional setbacks for structures replacing existing structures. But that new structure must be in the same size and location where that structure had been. The structures can be attached. There's a reduced parking requirement compared to what we currently would have for residential. So 1 parking space per unit can be required. The parking is not required if it's within a half mile of a high-quality transit corridor, half mile of a major transit stop, or a car share vehicle is within 1 block. And we did put these in our urgency ordinance, just so that we are making that requirement to the extent that we can. So I'll go now through the what the urgency ordinance has for lots, and I'll also talk about, we'll get to what HCD weighed in on, but I'll also talk to what are maybe some of the next steps on some of these items. So our ordinance requires that only individual property owner can apply for an urban lot split, not corporations and corporate persons. And we're going to be asking the city attorney to look further into that. So that's not something for you to have to weigh in and decide. Well, that's something for the city attorney to look into. Our ordinance reiterates the limits for sites with certain circumstances, if they're wetlands, hazardous waste sites, flood areas. So we'll be able to keep that in there. Lot splits are prohibited on historic properties or within a historic district. We'll be able to keep that in our ordinances. Our urgency ordinance specifies that the lot being split has not previously been split, and that it may not be adjacent to a parcel that has been split by the same owner or person acting in concert with the same owner. Now, for that latter part of that, we haven't seen anything from HCD on this, so we could continue to keep that in our ordinances. They may eventually weigh in on that. However, we can require that it cannot be a lot being split cannot have been previously split. The urgency ordinance limits the lot size to the limits of SB 9. So we did that same, that 1,200, it can be split to 1,200 square feet. They have to be relative equal size. So we have that in there. We require easements with public service providers for each resulting lot. That would be if there's like a flag lot and there's some easement that needed to be provided. And I think that that's a reasonable request because we would require that of any single family if they needed to have those public service easements. The urgency ordinance mandates that each resulting lot must adjoin the public right-of-way with a minimum frontage of at least 20 feet to ensure viable width of the home to be built. This is feasible to develop and is required of our current regulations. We have lot width requirements. So we're not asking for something that's beyond what is required for single-family developments. Also, we have the catch-all in our urgency ordinance that to the extent that these standards don't conflict with state law. So if HCD found something that conflicted, it would only be to the width would be to whatever extent that it's not conflicting with their law. There is a restriction on separate conveyance of dwelling units on the same lot, that it can't be a condominium, and that is something that's allowed by HCD, or by the state, I should say, but the regulations. So we'll keep that in there. The regulations specify only residential use, no short-term rentals, and an affidavit of owner occupancy. So we're going to keep that in there. We acknowledge that in our urgency ordinance that the coastal regulations apply in full. Obviously, the only distinction would be that the public hearing requirement that we normally might require. That was the only thing that we wouldn't be able to do. Also, for 2-unit development, both inland and coastal, similar to lot splits, we have in our urgency ordinance that it requires only individual property owners can apply. Again, we'll have the city attorney evaluate that as we take it back to city council. We require that the lot on which the 2-unit project is proposed must have been legally subdivided, and that's okay to leave in there. The ordinance sets limits for the sites when certain circumstances are established, the wetlands, hazardous waste. That's all allowed per SB 9, so we have that in our regulations. Our urgency ordinance prohibits 2-unit projects on historic properties or within historic districts. No more than 2 dwelling units of any kind may be built on a lot resulting from an urban lot split, and the state allows us to add that. If we didn't add that, they might be able to do more. So we are putting that regulation and keeping that regulation in. If the project is on a site that was not an urban lot split, limited to the 2 units plus the ADU and JADU, we have that limit in there. What you'll see, I think it was in your packet, we had the fact sheet from HCD, and they actually confirmed that. So we're good to keep that in there. For lot coverage, outdoor living space and setbacks, they're to be followed to the extent feasible, so that 2 primary dwelling units on the lot at 800 square feet are each could be permitted. That is the language that the state had in the legislation through SB 9. So as long as we have that to the extent feasible. So they have to demonstrate, it's not like, oh, well, I can't provide outdoor living space to the requirements that you have, so where I'm not going to provide any, it's going to be to the extent that you can. So demonstrating what square footage could they provide for that outdoor living space, or how close can they make the setbacks work. The urgency ordinance also requires a new street tree for each new unit or a fee in lieu. Our landscaping ordinance does state that trees should be planted and to shade turf, ground cover, and shrub planting areas to reduce water evaporation from these areas. We also require planting of public trees in our new tree ordinance, And the tree provision section of the urgency ordinance doesn't specify that we're talking about, it must be on site. It is a requirement that we have for single-family development anyway, that they have to provide a tree that would be a street tree. Now, if they don't have a parkway to plant that, then they do have to plant it on their property. So we're just requiring that same thing. And we put the in lieu because if they say, to that extent possible, if they're not able to plant it, they're going to have to pay for it to be planted in another location. The ordinance also requires tree replacement for mature trees. This is required per our subdivision standards and our landscaping ordinance. So it's not something that we're requiring only of SB 9 projects. We do require that of single family as well. So that's a lot about what our urgency ordinance has in it and how we can keep those things in it. We have a little bit more here, the regulations that we have limit the floor area of the second primary unit to 800 square feet and the height of the second primary unit to 16 feet and 1 story. We might have to look at that. And I'll go into the reasons why as far as what HCD has weighed in on. The city requires the parking as it's allowed per SB 9. Each primary dwelling unit on a lot, our ordinance says it must have its own direct utility connections. That's a reasonable, we require that of single family anyway. So it's not something unreasonable that we're requesting of SB 9. Each primary dwelling unit on a lot must have its own, I just said that one. All structures must comply with all current local building standards. Impact fees for additional primary dwelling units shall be charged and proportional for ADU and JADUs. That's per state regulation, so we can keep that in there. Our urgency ordinance requires that all other applicable standards apply to the extent that they do not conflict with state law, including applicable requirements for affordable housing. So this would be applicable when the inclusionary housing ordinance, would be adopted. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail because we actually have more on affordable housing that we might have to change in our ordinance. The residential uses that are allowed, no short-term rentals are allowed, and then again, the coastal regulations apply in full for the coastal zone. So the reason for a permanent ordinance, SB 9 went into effect January 1st, 2022. The law allows local agencies to adopt objective standards to govern these, obviously with limits. But if we don't adopt those, then it's just the state regulations. So again, 4 means 4. If we don't adopt our regulations saying on an urban lot split that it can only do 2 on each resulting lot, they could maybe do 4 on each. So we need to have that in our own regulations, and we need to make it in our permanent regulations. SB 9 was passed without study or consideration of the potential impacts related to traffic, greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, and other environmental factors. So that's why we adopted the urgency ordinance. But now we're looking at, it's been in effect for 1.5 years. Our urgency ordinance is now, it was an interim measure, and we now need to adopt the permanent ordinances before the end of this year. And more recently, and perhaps more importantly, the State Attorney General just issued a letter on Monday advising caution regarding urgency ordinances related to SB 9. So the sooner that we can get moving on getting our permanent ordinances in place, the better. Okay, so now we're going to go into the state advisories. Like I said, when I was here last in February of last year, talking about this topic, it wasn't the last time I was here, but talking about this topic, the HCD had not weighed in on the regulations and what municipalities can and can't do. They hadn't provided any guidelines, and they have since released a fact sheet that was in your agenda packet. The The fact sheet provides a high-level overview of key parts of the law and addresses some common questions that they have received. HCD does not have authority per se to enforce SB 9, but any violations to SB 9 might violate other statutes over which HCD does have the enforcement authority. And that includes the Housing Element Law, Housing Crisis Act of 2019, the ADU Law, Housing Accountability Act, and rental inclusionary housing. So with this, I'm going to go into probably the more significant way in that HCD has done, which is they'd taken a position on intensity of land use and SB 9 that they issued in April of 2022. If we go back real quick, the fact sheet was issued in March of 2022. And what they issued in April was really addressing concerns over what they felt were overreaching ordinances. And they really made an example of Temple City because what they said is, here is how we're weighing in on a lot of these what we feel are overreaching ordinances. So, and what they did was they pointed to, going back here where HCD enforcement authority is there, are on all these other laws. And so in the letter that they sent to Temple City, they addressed each of those where they felt this is where this is in violation of these other regulations where HCD does have enforcement capability. So I'm going to go over these just so that you can, I had gone through what we have in our urgency ordinance, kind of thinking through, it'd be great if we can put some certain restrictions in place, but just knowing as we go through these, what it is that HCD is going to be looking for when ordinances are adopted, and what they've already said are concerns. So we don't want to really, for us to put something into a regulation and then knowing full well that HCD has weighed in on it is just going to, just spin our wheels, and we're going to be coming back and making revisions. So the first is the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. And this law limits the ability of a local agency to reduce the intensity of land use anywhere where housing is an allowable use without concurrently increasing the intensity of land use elsewhere to compensate for the loss of residential development capacity. So where they pointed out concerns with Temple City's regulation, the first one was on the maximum unit size of 800 square feet. Now, Temple City had it where their ordinance had a maximum size standard for residential development in the SB 9 situations where the maximum size was 800 square feet, period. So I think that was for any of their units, they had that maximum. The development standards in the R1 zone district for Temple City imposed no equivalent limitation on the absolute maximum size of dwellings. It was much higher amount. So our urgency ordinance does limit the floor area of the second primary unit, but doesn't restrict the square footage of the first primary unit beyond what is allowed in the ordinance currently. So that's just something to take into consideration. That, we may be able to just move forward with that the way we have it written, because we're not changing what that initial first dwelling unit can be. For height limit, Temple City, their ordinance limited the maximum height of a new attached or detached dwelling built under SB 9 to 1 story and 18 feet. The development standards that they had currently limit the building heights depending on lot characteristics, but the SB 9 ordinance would impose the smallest 1 story and 18-foot height limitation on all units built under SB 9, regardless of the size or other characteristics of the lot. So this limitation, to the extent it prevents development of equivalent floor area compared to that allowed under the existing development standards, It reduces the intensity, this is HCD's determination, reduces the intensity of land use and represents a reduction in residential development capacity. So the Redondo Beach urgency ordinance does limit the height and story of the second primary unit. It does not restrict the height of the first primary unit beyond what is allowed in the ordinance currently. So HCD didn't directly weigh in on that. So we're not limiting it so that you couldn't have that first dwelling. And the point that they said is that you follow your requirements so that at least that 2 units of 800 square feet can be built. So that's what we were looking at with that the second unit, and the first, not having the restrictions beyond what is already allowed in single family residential. For courtyards, the Temple City ordinance requires that all new detached dwellings built under SB 9 provide an open space courtyard with a minimum area of 1,000 square feet and 10% of the lot, and with a minimum width and depth of 20 feet. The development standards in their zoning currently impose no such requirement on other dwellings. So as with that height standard, HCD found imposing a courtyard requirement in their SB 9 regulations would be a reduction in residential development capacity if it prevents the development of equivalent floor area compared to that allowed under the existing development standards. Our urgency ordinance only requires, as I'd mentioned before, outdoor living space to meet the requirements to the extent feasible to allow a second unit of up to 800 square feet. So it's not requiring that anything additional of the SB 9 units beyond what is already required for a unit. And as a matter of fact, if they can, they have to demonstrate that they have provided as much outdoor living space to the extent feasible to still build those the 2 dwelling units. So, we're following and complying with the SB 9 regulations on that. The next regulation that HCD weighed on was the housing element law. With this, an SB 9 ordinance should not create constraints on the development of housing that would reduce the economic feasibility of projects. So that's what they were looking at when they're looking at housing element law. For parking requirements, the Temple City ordinance prohibits a property owner from constructing off-street parking spaces that would serve the residents of an SB 9 unit and must remove existing driveways and driveway aprons that might facilitate off-street parking. So they were actually taking away parking for SB, and not allowing it for SB 9 units, but their development standards currently impose no such prohibition on the creation of additional off-street spaces beyond the 2 spaces per dwelling unit. So HCD found that these requirements impose a new burden of property owners seeking to develop housing under SB 9. As well, Temple City had an ordinance that prohibited the issuance of on-street overnight parking permits to residents of SB 9. So I think, they're definitely pushing the limits here to make it impossible for somebody living in an SB 9 unit to have a vehicle and park it anywhere near their residence. So we require in our urgency ordinance the parking as spelled out in SB 9 regulations. We're not going outside of that, knowing full well that they very clearly spelled out what you can and can't do for the parking regulations. Temple City also, they required that all units created under SB 9 be deed restricted to low or very low income households. Many of you were part of the conversations that we talked about inclusionary housing, where you have to, you can't make have the imposing requirements that are going to make it restrictive to build financially. So what, if you recall, when we were talking about inclusionary housing, we talked about having a reduced fee in lieu. So really, what they're looking at is, they were saying that it had to be deed restricted. We know that for us and in Redondo Beach, it wasn't until you hit 10 units that it actually was feasible for them to provide an actual unit on site fiscally. So for affordable housing, let's see. We would need to revisit this item because our regulations actually has, our ordinance does have where we were requiring that the second unit have that rental rate affordable to low income tenants if it's rented. What I would recommend that we put in there is that we change it, that the development has to meet any affordable housing requirements that the city otherwise requires. So that at that time that we adopt our inclusionary ordinance, they're gonna have that in lieu fee payment. And then this way, we're not conflicting with what HCD has ruled on Temple City. I know this is a lot of information, so please bear with me. We'll get through this. We'll have a little bit of discussion. You can digest it for a month and then we'll come back in August. The next was the Temple City ordinance required that all new detached dwellings be built under SB 9 achieve LEED Platinum certification. This requirement would substantially increase the cost of development of SB 9 units, and there was no such requirement on other dwellings in R1 zones in Temple City. So per HCD, these additional physical requirements would substantially increase the cost of development of SB 9 units and would likely result in a governmental constraint to the development of housing in violation of the housing element law. And then subterranean third story requirement. The Temple City ordinance required that a portion of the floor area of a dwelling built under SB 9 be located underground in certain instances. And HCD determined that could substantially increase the cost of development and may result in a governmental constraint into the development of housing per the housing element law. And the other law that they weighed in on regarding Temple City was the state's ADU regulations, accessory dwelling unit regulations. With that, the state ADU law allows for developments with both SB 9 units and ADUs. Up to 4 units may be built in the same lot typically used for a single family home. And I talked about that. Either if they split the lot, then only 2 units for each lot, or if they don't split the lot, they could have the 2 primary dwelling units, an ADU and a JADU. So it's a total of 4 dwelling units. Either way, that original lot would not be able to have more than 4. Again, we have to have that in our regulations for that lot split. Otherwise, they could do the 2 and the ADU and the JADU on each. So we want to really make sure we have that in our regulations. That said, the Temple City ordinance established a limit of 2 residential units on each lot developed under SB 9 and required that ADUs and JADUs count towards the limit even when a lot split was not proposed. So they were saying that you could only, even if you didn't split the lot, that you could only have the 2 units and not the JADU and ADU. And that was very clear in the SB 9 regulations regarding that. So I went over these various laws and HCD's points because, as I mentioned previously, although HCD doesn't have authority to enforce SB 9 itself, as you can see, they're tying in where a violation of SB 9 is also a violation of another housing-related law that they do have jurisdiction over. So we need to just be aware of what types of concerns HCD is considering as they're reviewing SB 9 regulations that municipalities are adopting. And I know that's a lot. Now I'm going to go on to the additional topics that the City Council had referred to the Planning Commission for your consideration. I'm going to go through these and then remember, these were referred to you prior to HCD weighing in at all. So I'm going to also maybe point out something we might want to think about when we're going through these. So the first was the Planning Commission, or excuse me, the council asked Planning Commission to acknowledge that Redondo Beach is not dominated by single-family housing, but rather has a majority of multifamily housing. This is something that can be added as a recital in our resolution, forwarding this to City Council, and I think then City Council would want to add that same recital into their ordinances as they adopt it, just so it's really making it clear that this is not really the place where SB 9 makes as much sense as perhaps some of those municipalities that do have those acre lots. And I think that that's more of what they were designing this regulation for, but unfortunately they made it a one size fits all. So I think we want to put that into our resolution as a recital. They asked for us to examine the tree planting requirement to ensure that it's adequate. Our urgency ordinance requires that new tree for each unit or a fee in lieu. And that's aligned with what we require single family. I think, per what HCD had weighed in on Temple City, we wouldn't want to require something additional or beyond what we require in single family. The next was incorporate applicable items for climate action plan, including requirements for cool roofs, solar panels, gray water systems, electric vehicle charging, greenhouse gas emission reduction. Our state building code has already started requiring some of these, such as EV and solar. Also, we don't currently have a document that ties our climate action plan to our zoning. So it's not something that we're already requiring in our residential that we could then also require here. And if we require it here and not in our other residential, that's where we're going to start running into problems per what HCD's feedback was. That said, we've already looked at some of these items in the objective residential standards. So we would be, our zoning requires that the objective residential, will require that the objective residential standards would need to be complied with. And a big part of those standards are those landscaping and permeability requirements. So I think that that's where we're going to be able to address some of these climate action plan items. And a year and a half ago, we didn't have that. We didn't know that was going to be part of the conversation. So I think that we can point out where that's already being addressed, as well as the solar panels and the EV charging that the state building code requires. The next thing that the city council asked you to do was evaluate the individual ownership requirement. Well, they asked in general that the individual ownership requirement properly addresses corporations. There's a lot of back and forth on what the language is there. Again, I'm going to forward this onto the city attorney for them to review and weigh in on and see if there's anything that we need to revise in that particular portion of the ordinances. The next item was to consider an option of requiring the owner to occupy, not just addressing the intent to occupy. The Redondo Beach urgency ordinance does have language that states intend rather than will. The reason being is that the SB 9 specifically states the bill would require an applicant to sign an affidavit stating that they intend to occupy one of the housing units as their principal residence for a minimum of 3 years from the date of the approval of the urban lot split, unless the applicant is a community land trust or qualified nonprofit corporation as specified. The bill would prohibit a local agency from imposing any additional owner occupancy standards on applicants. So I think that's pretty clear in SB 9 that was the intent here, was that you can require them to sign an affidavit that they intend to occupy, but not being able to require anything beyond. And I think that they were very, very specific when they were writing that language. So, with HCD watching that, I'd hate for that to be the thing that, that they, shoot our ordinance back to us or send us to some enforcement level. The next was to consider a requirement that the design is not to encroach into required front yard setback before exhausting the option to build to the rear and side yard setbacks in order to provide 2 units on 800 square feet each. If there is a priority of other items first, we could propose that to city council. It seems that would just be the rear and side yard of what they would be trying to encroach upon before they'd encroach on the front. And right now, those are at 4 feet. So, and that's a requirement of SB 9 that, it's similar to the ADU regulations. So we could certainly put that in there and think about how you would want that language to be phrased if we did put that in there. And the final one was review objective standards being considered by similar municipalities, evaluate affordability requirements. We should, tie our ordinance to whatever we adopt in the inclusionary housing when it comes to the affordability. And, the city council is considering a citywide discounted sliding scale in lieu for projects of 2 units and above. So that would be applicable. This would require them to provide that in lieu that has already been studied for economic feasibility, so we'd have that justification. As far as other municipalities, we at one point, Temple City was going to be one of the examples that we were going to show. And so it's really, I think it's more a point of looking at what they've weighed in on as far as what not to do and making sure that we're, and not just like, oh, well, that particular item, but more of what the concepts that they were talking about with each of those laws. What was the issue? Making sure that you're not requiring something of SB 9 that you don't already, that you don't require of your regular single family. Things that aren't going to be just very cost prohibitive. So just keeping those in mind as we go forward with different ideas. And as for applications to date, we've received 1 SB 9 application, that came in after the law went into effect. It was approved last month. It was a subdivision of a corner lot into 2 R1 single family, it's in the single family R1. It was divided into 2 lots. It was demolishing a single family home and constructing 1 home on each lot. So it's a pretty reasonable proposal. The one, they did have to request a modification for one of the setbacks for one of the, only one of the lots. But it truly, that is the only application we've had come in. We had originally, when SB 9 first went into place, we had a lot of inquiries, and nobody really questioned our urgency ordinance and the things we were requiring. I think that they're just realizing this is not the area where this is, is going to be the fruitful thing that they're looking for. Again, I think it's going to be those municipalities that, it's interesting. We have, there was in our, the city is part of a group of municipalities that is challenging the SB 9 regulations in the courts. And I'm just going to go, this is something that's out there. There's a declaration from the HCD representative that has already been submitted to the courts. So this is a public document. And one of the things they talked about is, there are so many single family, all these municipalities that have all this single family zoning, like 74% of their zoning is single family. Well, in our city, it's almost reversed. We're more multifamily than we are single family. And they were talking about the size of, lots. And in their declaration, this person was saying, a lot of these, single family lots, they're half acre and acre. And so they can really stand to have this on there. And I'm like, we don't even have quarter acre size lots. So it really, this isn't the place where this is, really the more reasonable location. That being said, that's an argument to be handled in the court. But really, I think what we're seeing is that the developers aren't saying that this is going to be the more fruitful option for them. So we're really not seeing the applications come in for that. Doesn't mean that they're not. We have one. We have other corner lots throughout the city. So it'll be interesting to see if we have additional that come in. So the next steps. We reviewed the city council comments, the things that they wanted you to look at. I, made note of just some cautions on those since HCD has weighed in on these regulations. Considering those more recent developments on SB 9 implementation from the state, the HCD fact sheet, the state advisories, we need to just keep those in mind as we go forward. And I'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. And, even if you want to start thinking about recommendations, but again, we're going to bring this back on August 17th. And then we'll finalize the ordinances based on your recommendations at that point. And then we'll bring those, the resolution on those ordinances for a public hearing in September. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. I know that's a lot of information.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's a
We have no
mindful.
questions.
Huh?
And we have no questions. That was so thorough.
It was very thorough, for sure, but
Let's just-
I know I have a question, and Commissioner Hazeltine has a question. My first question is this. Do I understand correctly that this is only applicable to areas and lots that are R1? And that anything R2 is completely exempt? So we're talking one R1 lot, potentially being divided into 4 independent parcels and housing units.
No.
No, okay.
So I'll go over that. So it's single family zoning only. That's R1 and R1A.
Okay.
R1A, those have already basically, that's already been split.
I'm looking forward to seeing what dividing that into 4 is going to look like.
That will be an interesting one. Now, remember, they can be attached, but so with that, there are 2 components to SB 9. One is the urban lot split. So it would be splitting that lot into 2. They can't split it into 4. They can split it into 2. They could they could choose to not split it, develop the 2 residential units on the main, on that lot, and then they could have an ADU and JADU. So they could have a total of 4 units on the lot. If they split it, they could only have 2 units on each of those lots. Per our ordinance. We had to put that in our ordinance to really limit it to that. Regardless, a single family lot that we have right now in R1, R1A, that would be, again, very interesting to see how they're going to do that. And that's why we also put that 20-foot width of frontage, because they're going to need to have access. Even if they do a flag lot and have like the main portion of it towards the back, they're going to need some form of access to that. So that's why we have that 20-foot width. But even with that, it's going to be in single family. The max that you would have on a current lot would be 4 units in the long run.
Right. But anything that is zoned R2 is completely exempt from this.
Correct. R2, R3, RMD, RH are all multifamily.
Okay. Commissioner Hazeltine.
Yes, okay, I got a couple notes here I took. So basically, I think, Brandy, from your presentation, the objective residential standards that this planning commission worked so extensively and exhaustively on for at least 5 meetings many meetings after midnight, was brought in front of City Council on Tuesday. They basically ignored all of our recommendation and extensively watered down the guidelines, specifically Councilman Obaji and Councilman Barrett. That could come back to bite us, because what's going to happen is they're bulking up. They're taking away some of the suggestions we made, which will end up bulking up our guidelines or our standards. And the state can then say, but you don't have those in your standards. So why should we not allow that new resident to be mansionized just as you allow now? So by them doing that on Tuesday, they're actually making SB 9, a stronger
Worse.
and worse present, I mean, that is just ridiculously the amount of time we put on that and how they treated. How to even say that the thought that we might put 20 hours into SB 9 before it gets back to them and they'll just disregard everything is very disheartening. As a planning commission, I was told that as a planning commissioner that I could make a difference. And we took our job very seriously, as you know. And so now what we worked on so hard is going to end up making SB 9 stronger and worse. And I can't tell you how disappointed I am, but getting off of my soapbox. So I just want you really, when you come back to us, I just need a lot of information on the affordability, because in SB 9, the state said we need more affordable housing. The Planning Commission has come out very strong on affordable housing in the city of Redondo Beach. So I need to know, I know in Temple City, they poo-pooed it, their considerations, but if as a city we are going to take affordable housing seriously, this is a perfect spot. I'd like a little bit more information on what does health and safety mean. So that was covered a little bit, but I'm not really clear on how we might make that stronger in the our recommendations to City Council. Okay. I discussed that. And then I'll come back because I've got to look at that letter from something about Davis White letter from the Yes in My Backyard group. I need to look at that again and come back about what about his letter. There was something about it that was so strange, but I'll come back to that. Okay.
All right, Commissioner Lamb.
This new SB 9 application is really a good, looking at it, could be a helpful example for us to see the potential for how this is going to unfold in our community. So I have some specific questions about this. And I think it's about, it ties to some extent with Commissioner Hazeltine's. Are bonuses utilized in this new application?
So they can for the initial single family. Whatever our regulation, our standards are for the main principal structure. For the second, what we have in here is that they can have 800 square feet. Like, so basically, if somebody were to build and utilize the FAR, I'm guessing you're talking about the FAR bonuses, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe we should back up, though, because in this case, so there's a couple of questions. One is, this was a lot split plus a 2-unit development, right? But there were only 2 units built. The plan is,
Right.
It's not built yet, right? 2 units, each, the lot sizes reduced to 4,500 and 4,200, right? That fits into the regulations, right? And each lot, oh, okay, so the question I would have is, what's the size of the 2 units?
So each of those can be, because it's a unit on each of the remaining lots, and it's going to be the principal, the main, the
Right.
first principal unit on each of those, they can build to what the standards are for a single-family lot, each.
Each?
Yeah.
And they each could have, okay, question then. They each then can have, since no more than 4, right? So they could have an ADU on each lot.
They could.
Okay. And because they're within the development standards, they can make use of the bonuses. Is that correct?
Only on that first
Only on-
structure.
Only on the first structure?
Yeah. Then we have the regulation, and we have our regulation and our urgency ordinance. So here's the thing. That second unit, they could make it one of 3 things. They could make it a JADU that's within. They could make it an ADU, which is going to have a restricted size of, they could do it up to 850 square feet, maybe 1,000 if they could fit 2 bedrooms into it. Hold on. Or the third option would be that they could have a second principal unit on that site. With that, our urgency ordinance says that second principal unit can be 800 square feet.
Right. But what I'm talking about is the second primary unit.
That's
You've got two-
that's what I just said. The
Okay, wait,
second primary unit could be up to 800 square feet per our urgency ordinance, up to 800 square feet.
Right. Okay, so you've got now 2 lots, correct?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm hearing you say is then you've got 2 lots. The first lot,
First house.
the first house on the first lot, right, can be up to development standards, 0.65.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got the second lot, and I'm visualizing the second lot. I'm hearing you say that on the second lot, they can only have an 800 square foot. No, that's right. So what I'm saying is, on the first lot, the first primary home, right, 0.65 with an ADU, JDU, et cetera, 800 square feet. Second unit, right? Second lot, same thing.
Yep.
Right? 0.65, but can have an ADU or JDU, et cetera, 800 square feet.
Correct.
Each primary unit on each, first primary unit on each lot can take advantage of the bonuses. Now, other issue here is in this particular lot split, their side, I think it's the rear and side setbacks are 4 feet, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right, per SB 9.
Yeah.
Right. So this actually increases the lot buildability for that initial, right? For the initial,
Right.
for the front unit.
That's the whole point with SB 9. Yes.
Right. For the
Right.
primary unit,
Right.
right?
And remember, I'm just the messenger. I am not the one promoting.
Why are you doing this to us?
No. And I hope I'm not communicating
No,
to you.
I know, but I want you to
that-
recognize, I understand the frustration of what this is.
I'm just trying to really
Yeah.
understand the dynamism really of how this in some ways ties into Commissioner Hazeltine's perspective. Is here you've got now more buildable space because due to SB 9, you could have on that initial lot, now you've got 4 units and you've got that the rear and side setback.
Yes.
Narrowing of that, increasing the size. So, plus, right, the bonuses, right? Just one other question, and I'm sorry, I may be going over.
Way over.
I'm so sorry. Is that okay, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So, have they presented, have they put in for an application for a building? And do you know what the building size is?
Yeah, they proposed those, didn't they? They proposed the residential units, yeah. They haven't submitted for plan check to get to be reviewed in building, but they submitted what they proposed, and we determined that meets the SB 9
Right.
requirements, and so they comply with that. They did not apply for an ADU on either of those sites, or a second unit of any sort on either of those sites.
Okay, I'm just gonna leave that. Thank you.
could.
But they could.
Yes.
Later on, they could.
But they could also, with the bonuses, they can go up to 80% of the lot, right? That could be a big house.
If they can meet those, I mean, I'd have to go back and look at those bonuses if they could meet it with those lots.
With
and
all
yeah,
those.
right.
Right. Slightly under 5,000 square feet, right? It's a lot, so they could do 80% of that if they meet all the bonus requirements.
Yeah, I think though there are some bonuses that counteract each other, like a side-facing lot versus, or side-facing garage versus, there was something, an alley access garage. I mean, like, like, not everybody's going to be able to have alley access garage, things like that, yeah.
Right. So you're saying maybe not 80%.
Right.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for allowing me to go over.
All right, thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
Commissioner Lamb. Do we have any public comments?
There are no Zoom, I'm sorry.
I heard a Holly.
Come on up.
Holly Osborne, please approach the podium.
Actually, I wrote a letter to the editor on this a couple years ago. So all I want to make sure is that those guys are meeting the International Building Code and meeting this fire separation distance. Are they?
If they meet the building code, there are a couple of ways to meet it. We have a 5-foot setback between buildings, but if they can also meet that building code if there are other fire ratings and they don't have windows and things like that that are facing.
Okay, so I'm assuming the builders are smart enough to know this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't know.
And they can be attached. I mean, that's the point with SB 9 is it allows it to be attached or detached as well. Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting with all the insurance companies canceling their fire insurance. We ought to be making more of an effort to meet fire separation distances and not less. There, I'm almost so far.
Right. It's whatever the building code would require, they'd have to meet the building code.
Yeah.
Thank you, Holly Osborne. Anything else? Any other?
There are no attendees or e-comments at this time.
Okay, we have Commissioner Boswell.
Oh, my turn again. So you may have covered this, but in all I'm a little confused. So when you split this lot, you scrape the lot, you split it in two, you build a home on each and an ADU on each. Are you also required to have a garage in there or two garages? Or how is parking dealt with as far as these kind of
Let me go back to the
smaller
parking. Parking, there's a reduced, we can't require the parking that we require now. What we can require is one parking space per unit. But parking would not be required if they're within a half-mile walk to a high-quality transit corridor, half-mile walk to a major transit stop, or a car share vehicle is within 1 block. I don't know that we have any car share vehicles in our city, which should be like Zipcar.
We also don't have anyone who's going to walk a half a mile.
Not my regulation. State's regulation.
So these things could pop up with only one parking space for a full-size house and an ADU.
Yes.
And would they then be expected to park in their driveway? Does the driveway still have to accommodate outside parking like in our normal regulations?
I don't know that they have where it's like ADUs where it could be any configuration. But our driveway isn't, our driveway requirement is more for the backup requirement, I think. It's not, you have to be able to fit so many cars in it. It's a certain distance. Like it would have to be like the garage would have to be 19, is it 19 foot? Yeah, minimum 19 feet from, the property line.
From the property. So the driveway merely has to be long enough so that you can pull out of your garage and then close your garage door manually and not be sticking out in the street or onto the sidewalk, right?
I don't know that you have to close your garage door manually, but yeah.
Who does anymore? But when your garage door opener dies, you got about 4 to 6 days before they fix it. You're closing it manually, or you're just not parking in it anymore. So the concern, of course, is that, and it sounds like we're probably not going to see a ton of these things.
Right.
But if we did, and it's in places where there's already no street parking, what kind of mess is that going to make? Is there any workaround for the city to mitigate what will become a civil war between neighbors over a parking space?
There's nothing that we can do in this ordinance that could be different than what the state allows you to require.
So the state says, so what?
The state says 1 parking space per unit, parking not required for the following, if it's a half-mile high-quality transit, half-mile major transit
That's
stop.
a yes. Okay. All right. So what a mess. Okay. Well, it's not the worst part of it.
Okay, Commissioner Hensley.
Yep. I had a question on other criteria. So I've read a lot of other cities' SB9 ordinances, and one of them that was in the agenda packet is from Torrance. They have an additional criteria about, it looks like they also have a 1-story, 16 feet or 18 feet or something for theirs. They have a new balconies, roof decks, and decks greater than 2 feet above grade are prohibited. If that's, I understand that's not something we require of residential, but if we say that we also require more than 4-foot rear setback. So does unique situations regarding privacy, can those result in unique solutions? Is that an objective, unarbitrary?
Yeah, we can't require that of an ADU. We can't limit it. All it is the 4-foot setbacks. So
I guess they have it in their ministerial 2-unit developments. I guess it would be for the 2-unit development. So.
Right. And that would be a stretch because now you're saying that the unit, I don't know. I think that's going to be something that they'll have an eye out for.
Okay, yeah, my concern is just putting decks or roof decks, or I don't really think that's the purpose of these extra units or kind of what they're intended for. And I think that we're allowing them to be built 4 feet from property lines and directly looking over fences and yards and other things, especially if they're 18 feet tall. So, okay, it's something I'm interested in, but I understand that it's a perhaps gray area. So, because every other one that I've read from other cities, I haven't found anything different or unique or other than what we're doing. So I'm generally satisfied with all the recommendations that we have and what we're doing. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Light.
clarify to me how the affordable housing rule Temple City didn't pass muster, because it's basically you have to have affordable housing if you build it, which made sense to me as a nice disincentive to financially do this all over the place. They said, no, you can't do that.
Right.
It's going to have to be 15 to 20% if that's what is the average. How are you going to do that on one thing? You're going to rent out 15% of your house to affordable
No,
housing?
it's just that you wouldn't be able to require that unit to be an affordable unit. And I know you unfortunately weren't able to be a part of our conversation about inclusionary. It all started before you were appointed. But with inclusionary, like when you require affordable housing in a development, there's you have to provide that threshold of like demonstrating that financially that what you're requiring could still be built. What we found in our financial analysis of that was anything less than 10 units couldn't afford financially couldn't afford to have a unit. So it's at that 10 unit, that's when you could start requiring, having the requirement. Now, that being said, what City Council is looking at doing is a citywide fee in lieu. And we actually, as a planning commission, you had made that recommendation of anything less than 10 units having that proportional discounted in lieu fee. So that at least there'd be some in lieu payment towards affordable housing, which goes to the point of what SB 9 says they wanted it to be, which was for affordable housing. But still demonstrating that it's financially viable and it's not prohibitive of the development of housing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Light. I have a question. So do I understand correctly that that this is saying that if you have a bus stop, a high-quality transit corridor within a half a mile, you don't need a parking space because you don't really need a car? Is that sort of the way you...
It's not just any bus stop. So this is going to be more...
A really nice bus stop.
There's a specific definition for these.
This is really the locations we're talking about for in Redondo Beach would be the metro station on, was it Marine?
Marine.
Yeah, and the transit center. Those
Okay,
would be the two. Those would be the two that qualify as
Oh, really?
that, yeah.
So the...
It's not just any bus stop.
The bus stop at, say, the corner of Redondo and Pacific Coast Highway wouldn't qualify?
No.
Okay, so, but if you're within a half a mile of one of these two bus stops, there's no parking required because you really don't need
A half a
it.
mile, one of those two
Half
transit.
a mile, yeah, one of those two. Also, do I understand that the person who wrote this law was Tony Atkins, the state senator from San Diego? Is that correct?
Let me look, because I actually,
They're from San Francisco?
I actually
No, I
put
don't think
those
Weenie wrote this one.
regulations.
This would be Tony Atkins, I
It
believe.
was,
Did you just say Weenie Roast?
thank you. I'm seeing if
Very
it,
good name.
because I just pulled up the Senate bill itself. I'm trying to see where it says
Wiener, isn't it?
who introduced. I don't know if it has it in what I'm looking at.
Well, it says SB 9 Atkins, Housing
Got it.
Development.
Then yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've seen pictures of Tony Atkins. I'm not sure she walks a half a mile real often. So this is an interesting imposition of, I don't know, but pretty idealistic. But anyway, any other questions from the commissioners?
Tony Atkins.
Okay. Do we have to formally close this discussion? Any other comments or questions?
I will make just one more comment.
All right.
I do hope the constituents from District 4 and 5 are well aware how their councilmen are now strengthening SB 9 in our city by throwing away the objective standards that we forwarded to them. I think they need to be aware of that.
All right, we don't have to formally close this discussion or anything.
We'll have this
Continued
on,
until,
we'll have this on the agenda for the August meeting.
okay, great. So
That's next month.
if we have no public comments, we can wind this one up.
So
And real quick, if I can ask, if any of you are like researching and you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I want to thank Commissioner Lamb. She asked a lot of really good questions in advance of the meeting that really helped me as well in my presentation so I could get that information out to all of you. So anything that you have that comes up and, oh, hey, I saw this in so-and-so's regulation, that allows us to really kind of think about all the things that HCD's already weighed in on, or we can look and see if they weighed in on those regulations as well. So that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Commissioner Lamb.
yes.
thank you.
Okay, items from staff.
I don't have any at this time. It's been a really, it's been a week.
It's
So
been a long
my-
week, hasn't it?
So exciting.
Okay, commission items and referrals to staff.
I have a question. It's a controversial question. There was something mentioned at the city council meeting about developers who have two sets of plans. One plan that they submit to the city, and then another plan that's different that is submitted to, that is given to the builder. So that caught my ear. And so I was wondering, is that illegal?
Yeah, they need to be following the plans that are approved by the city. I don't know that particular situation that was, if you're talking about what was discussed at the city council meeting.
That's what I heard.
And I don't want to go into that particular project. That's not something that's agendized. It's not
Yes.
in your purview.
Yes.
That being said, when something might be in a plan, if there's something that's an error or it's not part of the code, we can go back and make sure that there's a correction to that. They need to be following the plans. I don't think that was the issue for that particular case. They know, the contractor knows that, because they have to go through plan checks. So it's not just like planning signed off on and then they use something else. They have to go through plan check. These are engineered drawings that have to be signed off on, have to meet the building code. If a contractor's not meeting the building code because they're not building what was approved by the city, that's on that contractor and on their license. So those are things that they need to be concerned about.
Okay, it just came to my mind, and I didn't know one way or the other whether that was the case, but
Yeah.
I wanted to just, we're here, I wanted to have that checked out.
Thank you.
Well, and I think that there's a cautionary note there, and one that we were very conscious of when, the appeal on the Galleria, and that is that, we can sit here and look at plans and then we grant entitlements to somebody who owns a property or intends to buy a property. And so we grant entitlements to them. And once they have those entitlements, it seems like they can come back with, if something fits those entitlements, but is completely different than what they were showing us, and they have the entitlements that they didn't have before, they can literally come back with something just that none of us anticipated, or break off pieces of it and sell off those pieces with the entitlements, which is something we're observing, so.
It depends on, you can't just, an entitlement runs with the land. If it's something that's tied to that specific property and
Right.
all of that property, then all of that property has to comply with that. We could go into so many hypotheticals, and I do not need to be here till 2 a.m.
I guess
And it's not agendized for us to
Yeah.
talk about it, but That's why we want to make sure that you get the conditions in your approvals when you are reviewing an entitlement, that you're really considering all of those impacts. If it's something that, if there's phasing, are you allowing phasing, you're not allowing phasing. Those are things that you want to look at if it's like this needs to be, all of these things need to be part of one development. We just need to make sure that everything is spelled out in the conditions that you put in those approvals.
Okay, yeah, all right. Anything else, items for staff? Referrals to staff, anything? Okay. We are at the point where somebody could motion for adjournment.
Motion to adjourn.
It's kind of early.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye. Aye.
Vote no, Doug, vote no.
All those against, say no.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.
So this is an early night for you guys. Oh, good. Glad I signed up.